just to make sure that that actually, okay. Do you all see the recording light that it notifies you?
Yep.
Yes.
Great, perfect. Okay, so any other last minute questions before we have?
No, let me just quickly say, I saw the presentation yesterday. Ruth shared a lot of it with me ahead of time. I'm going to thank you whenever we get together, but CJI and CSG, Carl, all your team, and the entire CJI team, this is really good work. And whatever fruit may come or may not come of this, that is our job to kind of help hopefully facilitate that as well. But I just want to thank you in advance one time for the work that you've all done on this. This is really good. It's a great presentation. I hope people understand how good of a presentation it is and really what you're queuing up for us and kind of what we're queuing up together, right? And so thanks in advance for all the work. These things take so much time, coordination, everything else. Of course, thanks to my deputy Ruth for an integral part for us and kind of walking it through. So that's my first unofficial thanks, but really I look and I'm really moved by it. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. We're all really thrilled to be here and really huge thanks to your team for all of the time and efforts that you all have put forward as well. And a big thanks to our panelists for joining and being our expert voices for today. So yeah, thank you so much for that. And thanks for everybody for being here. So Ben and Brenna, for the first portion, since I'm going to be doing some talking, I'm going to ask that you all are in charge of admitting folks into our Zoom meeting. And are we green light? Are we ready to start? We can start introducing. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and admit people and we can kick the day off.
Here they come.
Wonderful. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. I'm going to give folks just a minute to get situated and to get comfortable. But welcome and good morning. As you all are joining, I'm just going to ask that you please remember to mute yourselves. Thank you so much. Wonderful. So good morning. Good morning. Welcome to Supervision Success in Colorado. I know you all have very, very busy schedules and demanding jobs. And so I'm really grateful that you all are taking the time to join us this morning and are participating in today's event. So please welcome, as folks are rolling in, get comfortable, get situated. Just two quick reminders that to keep yourselves muted throughout the presentation. And this event is going to be recorded, so just keep that in mind. Feel free to keep your cameras off if that is more comfortable for you. Also, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to utilize the chat function. My team and we will be monitoring it throughout this morning. So welcome, and thank you again for being here. I believe we have a good amount of people here. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Executive Director of the Colorado Department of Corrections, Dean Williams.
Thanks, Tracy. And it's good to see all of you, at least virtually. And I'll scroll through the participant list in a minute to see who's all here. First of all, thanks for attending today. Welcome. Glad you're here. This really is the start of a process of looking at supervision and making sure we as a state are getting that right and really listening and we're really looking at best practice around the country. Let me first of all start off by saying thank you to the Council of State Governments as well as the Crime and Justice Institute, CJI, for their partnership with us and really presenting data around what's been happening in Colorado, and also queuing up better questions for us around what that means for us as a department and as a state. And I know there's many of you from different backgrounds who are on here. I think I actually saw some people who have been on supervision or maybe are on supervision on this call. That's great. Glad you're here. I know there's some legislators and others who are on this call. Thank you for your time. I think the presentation that's coming in front of you in terms of the data, I think you will find very interesting and compelling, as well as asking better questions. So, you know, we've really joined this partnership because we really know that smart supervision really equals safer communities, right? Too little supervision or people that are concern us or that we're worried about can cause problems in terms of community safety. But the converse is also true. Too much supervision for lower risk people, it causes equal amounts of problems, and so the right amount of supervision for the right person is the goal. Because if we get that right, we have safer communities. We reduce recidivism, and we reduce people being pulled up from the roots that they have established. And when you do that, you want to make sure you're getting it right and you're doing well on that. And so even prior to the pandemic, we were making some moves on this front, and all credit to my division of parole and Ruth and David Johnson and my head of division of parole and the rest of his team for some of the movement. I think you're going to see some of that in some of the presentations. And again, so with the pandemic, things have changed, and there's an opportunity I think we have in front of us not to go back to parole as usual or the way the parole used to be. And just so you know, we're not the only state. The rest of the country and the rest of my colleagues around the country who oversee parole or probation in their state jurisdictions are asking these same questions. What should it look like? Where should we go? What does the data tell us? What does the research tell us? And then what does it mean to us? So I'm really hoping today is that we really have an opportunity to start this process and really think about where we should go. And so it's an opportunity. This is a step, the first step, right? In a journey of what this should mean to us. There's no deciding thing today. There's some questions I think CSG and CJI are going to queue up to us, and we welcome that. And that's a good start in how we all, not just the people on this call, but other people who just can't make this call as well, should be asking what questions we should be asking of each other. And by the way, if you're a legislator listening and you can't see the presentation, I'll make sure it gets to you. This is not some secret squirrel presentation. I want to be able to make sure we can share it across the board, because I think the data in it is going to be very interesting, compelling to you. And here's my last sort of comment. The key here is to ask better questions of each other, right? And I think that starts with being honest and forthright around what's going well, kind of, and what's not going well, right? I've said to my team, and even in my old state, you never know, you can never figure out what should be fixed, whatever fixed means to each one of us, unless you're honest about where you stand at the particular time, right? So I think a big part, what I'm so proud about my entire department, we don't get it right all the time, by the way, believe me, we don't. But we are very reflective as a department, and I have a really great people in leadership in this department, that we have gained a culture of trust with each other, to ask better questions of each other, and to be honest about what we like and what we think is going well and what's not. And then if we kind of disagree about it, like we better talk about it, and we better get out in front of us, because through that process, it's kind of painful at times. You just make better decisions. And sometimes when there's tough decisions that may be made, you're just in a better spot to really think them through. So today is the first step, I think, down a road of exploring some very important topics around supervision in Colorado. And I'll give a shout out for us to start with, to say the goal is to be honest and transparent around what the data tells us, what we like about it, maybe what we don't like about it, and nobody panic, right? I mean, let's stay in there, lock arms, and figure out what it means, because if we get it right, what we have is more targeted supervision, one, and two, as I said, for probably the third time, is you actually get better results and safer communities out of getting this right. The goal is really about how do we advance community safety around supervision and really target those individuals who need this and who doesn't need that, and really to make sure that that's a balance. And what right looks like, I realize we don't know exactly what right looks like. I don't know exactly what right looks like, but today is the start of that journey, and I'm really excited. Again, thank you to CSG and CJI, and to all of you who are in attendance today. And I look forward to this as long as possible. I might have to jump in and out periodically, but I'm going to be tracking as much as I can for the morning. And if you miss part of this, again, to get the presentation, we'll have others we can follow up, make sure that you get it if you have to leave yourself. With that, Tracy, back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Executive Director Williams. Really appreciate that welcome. Before I launch into my section, I just wanted to recognize that Representative Leslie Herod has joined us this morning. And so I just want to thank her for joining, and not to put you on the spot, but just wanted to see if Representative Herod, if you have any comments that you would like to share with the group before I start my section.
Sure. Well, good morning, everyone. I am just glad to be here. I'm excited to see the information and data that you'll be presenting today, and always happy and honored to work in.
Oops, Representative Herod, I think you may have accidentally muted yourself.
Oops, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. I just wanted to say good morning and thanks for having me. Always proud to work with DOC on these issues. It's great to have a partner in the Department of Corrections who really understands the balance between, or is searching for the balance between that public safety aspect and making sure that offenders have a pathway to success when they re-enter into the community. And so just excited to see the data and to think about how we can move forward together on some of these points. So thanks so much for having me.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you for being here. I really appreciate your time. So I am Tracy Gillespie. I am with the Council of State Governments Justice Center, and I work on the Course Corrections Project. And we at the CSG Justice Center, we are a national, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization and membership association that serves state officials in all three branches of government in order to provide policy and research expertise to develop strategies that both increase public safety and strengthen communities. Some of the Justice Center course corrections team within Colorado that you will meet today include Portia Allen Kyle, our Deputy Division Director, Carl Reynolds, our Senior Legal and Policy Advisor, Laura Vanderloo, our Project Manager, Brenna Callahan, our Public Affairs Manager, and myself. So Course Corrections is a partnership with Recidivism, the Pew Charitable Trust, Arnold Ventures, and the Correctional Leaders Association. And this initiative was developed in order to support states with reassessing how did the COVID-19 pandemic impact their correctional practices and population. So our course correction team, we're aiming to translate those lessons into transformational and sustainable legislative and administrative policies that both reduce prison populations and support supervision success. So our two overarching goals for our course corrections project within Colorado, in partnership with the Department of Corrections, are to one, understand whether statute and policy are aligned with evidence-based practice for parole supervision, and two, to convene partners in order to develop holistic policy changes that improve successful outcomes for people on parole. So in order to set the contextual stage, I would like to hand it over to my colleague, Carl Reynolds.
Thank you, Tracy. Hello, good morning to everyone. Thank you, Director Williams, also. That was a really apt introduction to today's convening. And thank you, Representative Herod. Great to hear you again. We got to work a little bit together last summer on a presentation at CSG West around police reform and the pretty momentous bill that Representative Herod worked on last year. As Tracy said, we're focused today on the population of people on parole in Colorado in the post-pandemic era. And this slide is intended just to orient us to the overall scale of the Colorado criminal justice system leading up to the pandemic. And this has population counts from 2009 to 2019. If you view the slide from the table from the bottom up, you'll see that progression. So in 2019, circled by the red box, there were over 19,700 people in prison and over 11,500 people on parole as part of an overall system of correctional control of 110,000 on some form of control. And as in all states, you'll see that the volume of people on probation is by far the largest component of that overall 110,000. In the preceding decade, the prison population decreased from almost 23,000 in 2009 to that 19,700 number. But it's interesting to note in the blue circle, you can see the parole column there. The parole population has stayed pretty static. It fluctuates up and down, but it has hovered right around 11,000 that whole time. I wanted to note this table that we're using right now is borrowed from one of the really excellent reports by the Office of Research and Statistics in the Division of Criminal Justice of your Department of Public Safety. Kim English, Linda Harrison, and the rest of the ORS staff routinely produce really good, amazing analytical resources. And I want the folks in Colorado to appreciate what a gold mine you have there in the DCJ under Joe Tomey and Stan Hilke. We get to work in a lot of states, and the analytical capacity in Colorado is outstanding, not to be taken for granted, and one of your many assets as a system. Next slide, please. Speaking of good work, the Vera Institute in New York City has been a really terrific resource on what happened to correctional populations during the pandemic. And this slide draws some key points from a report they just published in June, just this month in 2021. It is a really rich resource. There's a footnote there that you'll be able to see someday. But there's a footnote telling you what this report is. It's called People in Jail and Prison, Spring 2021. And they looked at incarcerated populations across the country in prisons and jails in two phases. The first phase is the first half of 2020, the beginning of the pandemic. And then the second phase is the following 12 months. So June of 2020 to June of 2021. And the thrust of this report is their statement, the statement in red here, that after major drops in incarceration in jail and prisons during that first phase, systems began to rebound. So the decline in incarceration slowed, and jail counts in particular, the first bullet point here in black, turned around and started up again. And now the report includes some state-by-state counts. So while the first bullet here talks about jail populations nationwide, a data table in the full report reflects that Colorado jails went from about 12,500 to 7,000 in the first phase, a 45% decrease, and then rebounded, grew back up to over 9,000 in that second phase, a 33% increase. There were actually only 12 states with good data on jail populations, including Colorado. And of those 12, Colorado had the biggest percentage swings, both decreasing and then increasing. So interesting to see what happened in your state at the local level. Next slide, please. So back at the state level, this graph is actually from data collected by the CSG Justice Center research team based here in Austin, where I work. We are updating the information in our confined and costly report. That's another thing you could Google if you wanted, that was published in 2019. And it focuses on the impact of revocation as a source of admissions to prison. I asked the researchers that are updating that data to just give us the Western state prison population changes from 2018 to 2020. So 3 data points for each state. So this visual would not be too busy. And interestingly, this shows that Colorado is almost exactly on the average for what happened to prison populations in the Western states. As an aside, and perhaps for the benefit of Director Williams, I wanted to point out Alaska, his former state, at the top of the graph, the only Western state that increased its prison population in this time span. It's interesting, while Colorado and other states really sharply limited admissions into the prison from county jails during the pandemic, Alaska has no county jails. It is a unified corrections agency, so it handles pretrial and convicted people as well. And I think that's a key feature of their system that constrain their ability to shrink. Hawaii is another unified system. You can see them almost at the bottom of this graph. They were under aggressive court orders during the pandemic, and I think that probably explains how dramatically they shrank. Next slide, please. So a lot of things changed during the pandemic. In Colorado, courts closed, cases resulting in prison sentences dropped by 1/3, probation revocations dropped by 53%, parole revocation admissions dropped by 61%. The parole board's releases increased by 65% compared to the quarter before the pandemic. Governor Polis issued an executive order affecting earn time, eligibility for special needs release, eligibility for intensive supervision, and so on. We all learned new ways to conduct our lives and our work, like today. We can get a lot done without traveling all over the country. But some pandemic changes should not be adopted. We need courts to reopen so we can have jury trials in a democracy. We need the ability to protect victims from domestic abusers. And I think we've learned that we humans just plain need to see each other face to face from time to time to do what we need to do. So we've learned some things, and our question today is, what did we learn about safe supervision and success from these external forces that affected and changed the work? Next slide, please. So of course, there were changes to how supervision in the community works for both clients and staff. Reduced or zero in-office reporting removed barriers for some people and created new barriers for others. Access to community-based services for people on supervision diminished or maybe disappeared, and maybe so did funding to support those services. So what changes are worth keeping? That's the purpose of today's conversation. As the morning plays out, we'll explore the policy approaches listed here, asking what is the current practice, what should be the practice, and what barriers stand in the way. Next slide, please. To his credit, Director Williams reached out to 2 technical assistance providers, as you've heard, the Council of State Governments Justice Center, us, and the Crime and Justice Institute, to explore and publicly share this policy discussion about supervision success for people on parole. So we at CSG have been really counting our blessings. We've been very fortunate to collaborate on this work with our friends and colleagues at CJI who do such similar work to what we do. It's just been a kind of a great opportunity for us to get to know some close colleagues. And so now I'll turn this over to Valerie Mead from CJI to take us into the second portion of today's event, which is a deeper exploration of data about the population of people on parole. Valerie?
All right, thank you, Carl. And definitely we mirror your sentiments. This has been a great working together on this. So first I'll just talk a little bit about the Crime and Justice Institute. So the Crime and Justice Institute is a team of experts who provide nonpartisan consulting, policy analysis, and research services to improve public safety in communities throughout the country. Our work helps develop and promote evidence-based practices that inform practitioners and policymakers, including corrections officials, police, courts, and political and community leaders. Our work is to assist these groups in making adult and youth justice systems more efficient and cost-effective, and also to promote accountability for achieving better results. If you could move to the next slide, please. So I'll start by talking about the the revocation analysis project and kind of to enter into the data that we're going to talk about today. Could you go to the next slide, please? So CJI's revocation analysis project began in July of 2019. Supported by Arnold Ventures, CJI has partnered with 4 states to understand factors that may drive revocations from community supervision across the country and identify policy and administrative solutions to improve supervision outcomes and reduce revocations in a safe manner. Colorado is one of 4 states that has partnered with CJI for this effort. The other 3 are Mississippi, Florida, and Montana. And then I'll talk a little bit more about specifically what we're doing in Colorado on the next slide. So in Colorado, CJI is collaborating with both the Department of Corrections Division of Adult Parole and with Colorado Judicial Branch Division of Probation Services. Through partnership with these state partners, CJI seeks to gain an in-depth perspective on factors that may impact operations. For the past 18 months, CJI has been conducting 2 separate system assessments in Colorado. We're examining quantitative data to identify trends that may exist. But as you know, data can only tell us part of the story. So CJI has also been conducting in-depth qualitative assessment for both agencies. This assessment includes policy and statute review, also focus group interviews across the state with staff, supervisors, administration, as well as many agency partners, several of you who are on today we've spoken with, but defense attorneys, prosecutors, parole board, advocacy groups, to name a few. CJI has also partnered with the MOS group to take a look at organizational culture within each agency. We are currently in the process of wrapping up system assessments for each agency, and we hope to release final reports around late summer. These reports will include findings from the system assessment. CJI will also recommend a series of policy changes, both legislative and administrative, that can be applied to improve outcomes and safely reduce revocations. The next phase of the revocation analysis project will be providing targeted technical assistance to each agency as they implement policy and practice changes. This implementation assistance may include facilitating work groups, updating, changing administrative policies, training on various evidence-based practices. The project will culminate in a national report that synthesizes lessons learned from each of the 4 partner states and may serve as a resource for other jurisdictions across the country. So now I'm going to turn it over to preliminary findings specific to parole, and my colleague Maya Vlachnik is going to present these to you. Maya?
Thank you so much, Val. Hello, everyone. As was just introduced, I'm Maya Vlachnik with CJI, and as the data lead for Colorado Parole, I'm going to be sharing some of the preliminary findings from the assessment that we've done looking at data provided by CDOC. So I just want to highlight before I start that word preliminary. Again, we're still looking through our assessment. We're still finalizing those findings. We're still reviewing them. So these are just some initial findings that we wanted to share with everyone today. So next slide, please. So before I get started talking about findings, I also want to highlight that for many of these slides that we'll be talking about, we'll be looking at or seeing 2019 as the endpoint year. That was the most recent data that we had when we started this process. So in a few places, we'll be supplementing that with data from 2020 and 2021, especially when we talk a little bit about the COVID assistance that we provided as well, which we'll discuss in more detail later. So just again to emphasize, 2019 is going to be the last year that we'll be talking about for many of these slides. So to recap a little bit, CSG talked about this earlier, but to share that the prison population in Colorado has steadily gone down over the course of the decade, a decrease of about 13%, but the parole population has stayed relatively steady. We see an increase of about 1%, but otherwise relatively flat as of 2019. So next slide, please. So as I said, we have some supplementary data from more recent years. This is data from CDOC. So we're seeing here in about March of 2020, that drop in prison population and that increase in parole population as a result of COVID mirroring one another. And then we also see that at the start of this year, 2021, slow, steady decreases in both populations throughout the past few months. So next slide, please. And so taking a look at some overall trends over time and types of parole completion. Again, we have our analysis up through fiscal year 2019, and then the 2 more recent years provided to us by DOC. So we see that successful parole completions were only about 45% of total parole completions in 2014. And since then, they have been increasing. So even as of 2019, they were more than half of all parole completions. And in 2020 and 2021, we see them grow even further, representing now more than 3/4 of all parole completions. And that's been driven by, in large part, as you can see at the bottom of that graph, the percent of all parole completions that are early discharge. So at the start of the decade, only about 3% of all parole completions were early discharge, and that's grown to 24% in the most recent year of data here. And not only that, but early discharge now also represents about 1/3 of all successful parole completions. So overall, we're seeing more successful completions and we're seeing more use of early discharge. Next slide, please. So before we talk about the other side of completions, revocations, we wanted to briefly review the way that CDOC defines a revocation due to a new offense, a criminal revocation versus a technical revocation. So the way that we have split this out in our data is determined by these definitions. It was already coded into the data that we received as the type of prison admission. So that distinction exists in the data and it reflects these definitions. So a criminal revocation reflects an individual sentenced to CDOC on a new felony by a judge. Whereas with a technical revocation, we see these 6 statutorily defined violations. I won't review all of them here. You can skim them. So we have those statutorily defined violations. And we also have individuals revoked for a complaint that contains a criminal charge or conviction that does not carry a felony or misdemeanor sentence from a judge alone or in conjunction with other technical violations. So it's a slightly broader definition than you might think of when you hear technical violation. And we just wanted to make sure that that was clear before we discuss the distinction between those 2 types of revocations. So next slide, please. Having made that distinction, we can now look at trends over time in those 2 types of revocations. Again, we have our analysis up until 2019, and then the 2 more recent years provided to us by CDOC. So we see that in 2014, overall revocations, primarily driven by those technical returns, peak at nearly half of all parole completions being those technical returns. And since then, we've seen a steady decrease and then a much sharper decrease over the past 2 years, reflecting similar growth in successful completions. So technical returns go from representing, again, nearly half of parole completions earlier in the decade to only 9% in the most recent year of data. And we also see in 2021, the returns for technical violations and new crimes are just about equal, which is the first time that that has occurred throughout the decade. So next slide, please. So next, we'll be highlighting a couple of findings, again, preliminary findings from our data. One of those is going to be the revocation rate for certain groups. So when I say revocation rate, what I'm saying is the proportion of completions for each group from these highlighted years that are revocations. So here we're looking at kind of what that change has looked like over time by risk level. So when we talk about risk level here, we mean risk level at parole start date. So whatever the earliest risk, whatever the most recent risk assessment prior to the start of parole was, that's the risk level that we're looking at here. So we see that over the decade, the revocation rate for each of these groups has decreased, which makes sense since the overall revocation rate decreased. And we see that as risk level increases, so does revocation rate. So looking at 2019, for example, of everyone determined minimum risk at the start of parole, who completed parole in 2019, 18% of them were revoked. So conversely, 82% were successful completions, as compared to maximum risk individuals, 51% of which were revoked. So more maximum risk individuals were revoked than successfully completed. So again, revocation rate increases as risk level increases. Next slide, please. So also highlighting revocation rates by sex, looking at what percent of men and women completing parole across the decade were revoked. And we see again, for both groups, the revocation rate has decreased over time, and men have a higher revocation rate than women. So in 2019 and in 2011 and throughout the decade, men have been more likely to be revoked than women. So not only are there more men on parole, it's about 80%, as well as about 80% of revocations tend to be male, but even within each group, men are more likely to be revoked than women. Next slide, please. And then finally, we wanted to highlight some trends in revocation by race. So first, we wanted to look at the racial breakdown of revocations just overall in terms of what that distribution looks like. So we see, first of all, across the decade, for every racial group, there are fewer people being revoked from parole in 2019 than there were in 2011, again, as is the overall trend. So we see about a 23% reduction for individuals who are white or Latinx. We see about 41% for individuals who are Black, about 6% for those who are Asian or Pacific Islander, and we see really small numbers of that group, so the trends are going to look a little different for them just because they're a much smaller group. And then about a 14% reduction for Native or American Indian individuals. So again, fewer people of every race being revoked in 2019 than in 2011. Next slide, please. So again, looking at both numbers and rates, so what proportion of individuals of each race were revoked versus successfully completing. And again, almost across the board, we see lower revocation rates in 2019 than in 2011, the one exception being that, again, very small group of Asian or Pacific Islander individuals. But otherwise, again, we see a revocation for everyone. And the other thing that I wanted to highlight here is that the revocation rates remain highest for Black and American Indian individuals. So revocation rates have gone down for every racial group across the decade, but those Black and American Indian individuals are the only groups where they are either equally likely or more likely to be revoked than to successfully complete. Next slide, please. So the other finding that we wanted to highlight reflects time on parole prior to revocation. So here we're taking a look at time on parole prior to completion by type of completion. And one of the trends we're seeing is kind of opposites for successful completion and revocation. So individuals who successfully complete are spending a little over a month less on parole in 2019 than they were in 2011. Individuals who are revoked are spending a little over a month more on parole in 2019 than in 2011. So across the decade, we're seeing individuals revoked prior to their first year on parole. And we see individuals who successfully complete in 2019 spending about twice as much time on parole than those who were revoked, about 16.5 versus nearly 9 months. Next slide, please. So breaking this out by type of revocation, we see that in 2010, individuals who were revoked for new crimes were revoked about 2 months later than those revoked for technical violations. And then across the decade, they start to follow very similar trends, and that gap starts closing up until 2019, where individuals are spending about the same amount of time on parole before revocation, regardless of reason for revocation. There's really very little difference between those revoked for technical violations and those revoked for new crimes. They're being revoked at about the same point in their parole, again, a little less than 9 months in. Next slide, please. And then finally, we just wanted to take a look at the overall distribution of time on parole prior to revocation. So we see in the prior slides, we were looking at the median, which means that in 2019, about half of individuals who were revoked from parole were spending 9 months or less on parole, and about half of individuals revoked were spending 9 months or more. So here we can see exactly how that shakes out. We see that about half of everyone is at that 9-month mark or before, about half of everyone is at that 9-month mark or later. And we also see that the highest number of people are revoked at 6 months. That's where the distribution peaks. So we see the highest number revoked 6 months into their parole, about half revoked at 9 months or earlier, and about 68% revoked at a year or sooner. So the majority of revocations are occurring prior to a year spent on parole. Next slide, please. So just to briefly recap some of what we've talked about, successful parole completions and especially use of early discharge have increased significantly throughout the decade and especially since 2019. Revocations due to technical violations have steadily decreased since 2014, with again that largest decrease occurring over the past 2 years. And the majority of revocations occur within that first year on parole, regardless of the reason for revocation. Next slide. So the next steps for our project, first we are looking to complete our assessment, finalizing the review of the data, as well as supplementing that data with a file review, looking at a little more depth into certain aspects that the data does not fully tell us the story. As Val said, we're looking to release that report outlining our findings and our recommended policy and practice changes later this summer, and developing an implementation plan to put some of those changes into practice in collaboration with DOC, including that review of 2020 and the policy and practice changes in response to COVID. So if we want to progress to the next slide, I can pass the baton over to Mike Wilson, who has been helping us take a look at those changes and share some of the findings from that process.
Great, thank you, Maya. Yeah, I'm going to change gears a little bit here and focus on really the last 2 years, looking at changes that took place as a result of COVID and what those changes look like over the last 9 months or so. If you could go ahead and go to the next slide. So to start off, we began conversations, I think it's been about a year ago, with Meredith and Ruth, and wanted to look and say, is there something that we could do at CJI to help look at changes that Colorado implemented as a result of COVID? And so we met, we had a number of calls, had a fairly extensive list of different policies and practices that have been changed in Colorado on the parole side as a result of COVID. And we narrowed it down to 2 areas that we really wanted to focus in on. And those 2 areas were the low risk, low custody caseloads and early discharge. And unfortunately, at this point, we don't have enough data. We're still in the process of this analysis. We don't have enough data to say much about early discharge yet. So this presentation is going to focus on the low risk, low custody caseloads. And so we were able to talk through with Colorado DOC to see the areas that were most important to look at. We worked with Arnold Ventures, and they were happy to support the project of moving forward to look at the implementation of low risk, low custody caseloads, how that changed as a result of COVID, and then to begin to explore the levels of effectiveness as a result of these changes. Has it been effective? And we have some, again, very preliminary results I'll go through today. You go to the next slide. So low risk, low custody, this is something that's not new to COVID. This was a policy and practice that Colorado had in place well before COVID hit. And the reason behind low risk, low custody is Director Williams had said at the beginning of the presentation, is making sure that individuals get the right level of supervision. And so evidence would suggest that low risk individuals do not need the same level of supervision as medium and higher risk individuals. And so in Colorado, you all were already doing this with the lowest risk individuals, putting them on a different caseload where there was less intensive supervision, because research shows that individuals who are low risk are more successful when they aren't monitored as closely and don't have as much or as intense of supervision. So after COVID hit, though, there were some major changes, and some of these are listed here. But the main one I want to point out is that there was a bigger focus on reviewing the cases to find out individuals who would move on to low risk, low custody. So Colorado staff was doing this work. There was also a focus on and a policy change to allow medium risk individuals to move on to low risk, low custody caseloads. And so we want to take a look at that and say, well, what was the impact of that? Is it a big shift in the number of individuals? And if so, what sorts of outcomes do those individuals have that were moved on to the low risk, low custody caseload? Can you go to the next slide? And as Maya had said for her presentation, these really are preliminary findings. These may even be earlier on than that because we're still in the middle of this analysis. We're hoping to follow these individuals through administrative data to see what were the outcomes of individuals and going all the way through the end of actually today, June 30th. And so clearly this presentation doesn't take into account the most recent few months worth of data. And so we're hoping to get that data from, we're working with DOC and we're working with the courts as well to get outcome data that is more recent. So these findings are actually they're preliminary, but they're also incomplete because we don't have all the data yet to pull that information in. So on to the next slide. All right, so what happened when COVID hit? I think this graph is really striking. We can see pretty clearly that April 2020, when the policies changed, when COVID hit and became a real issue in most states in March, and you see that the policy change the practice change and policy change that took place in April, you see a huge difference in the number of individuals who are moving on to low risk, low custody. In April of 2019, you have a number that's, I think that number's in the 30s, definitely below 50. And by 2020, a year later, looking at year over year for that same month, you have around 650 individuals who are placed onto low risk, low custody. In the months after April, you see a continued heightened number of individuals moving on to low risk, low custody. So clearly, this was a practice that was being used in increasing measure as following COVID and the policy changes that went into place. So for the remainder of the slides, if you go on to the next slide, for the remainder of the slides, I've labeled things as pre-COVID and post-COVID. And the way I defined this was that April 1st, 2020 cutoff. So the post-COVID is the 9 months in the calendar year that's following April 1st, 2020, so April through the end of the year. And the pre-COVID period is the 9 months preceding that period ending in March 31st of 2020. So we have a pre-COVID period and a post-COVID period. Both are 9 months that we had data for. And so you can see a big increase, as you saw in the earlier graph around April, that increase took place. And you can see broken out by risk that the primary increase here is for medium risk individuals. And those medium risk individuals, there's nearly, post-COVID, there were nearly 3 medium risk individuals for every 1 low risk individual. Prior to COVID, it was about 1 to 1. And so you can see that the real focus here was moving individuals who were medium risk onto low risk, low custody with roughly the same, there's a slight increase there, but roughly the same number of low risk individuals who were on low risk, low custody prior to COVID as there were after COVID. Go on to the next slide, please. And so we wanted to look at what's the impact of this been. And again, moving forward, we're gonna look at longer term outcomes. But the first outcome we could look at here for low risk, low custody individuals, I want you to focus on that first bar or the first row of bars there, the revocations. And so you can see that those who were on low risk, low custody are much more likely to be revoked. So in the pre-COVID period, 29% of those who were not on low risk, low custody, again, this is all low risk individuals we're looking at here. We're focusing on the low risk individuals for this slide. The low risk individuals who were on low risk, low custody were revoked only 6% of the time compared to those who weren't on low risk, low custody of roughly 39% of the time. So you see a very large difference between those who are revoked if they're on low risk, low custody or not on low risk, low custody. We look at the bar on the right. This is the post-COVID period. And we saw this in Maya's slides as well. We see a very steep decline in revocations in 2021 and more recent data. And so you can see that in the post-COVID period, the revocation rate for both those who are on low risk low custody and those who weren't have declined, going from 29% to 12% for those who weren't on low risk low custody. For those who were on low risk low custody, we see a decline from 6% down to 2%. So those who are on low risk low custody post-COVID were nearly a third, 1/3 is likely to be revoked during the post-COVID period. So at least preliminarily, we're seeing what we would hope to see. We see that those who are on low risk low custody are much less likely to be revoked. And even as the state moved to put more and more people on low risk low custody, those revocation rates fell, and they fell more rapidly than they did for the non-low risk low custody population. If you go on to the next slide, please. And so I wanted to look and say, well, is that only low risk people that are doing well on low risk low custody? What about all those medium risk individuals we saw that were being moved on to low risk low custody post-COVID? And so we can see in this graph a similar trend where you see a much lower revocation rate, both pre and post-COVID, for those who are on low risk low custody. 37% compared to 7% in the pre-COVID period. And then in the post-COVID period, you see 2% compared to 19%. So those who are medium risk in the post-COVID period and were on low risk low custody were almost 1/10 as likely to be revoked. So huge differences between those who are on low risk low custody and their likelihood of being revoked. And the good news is that even as more and more individuals were put on low risk low custody, these medium risk individuals, their revocation rate actually fell more rapidly than the revocation rate of those who are not on low risk low custody. So again, preliminary data, and we're still working on including more analysis for this, but certainly positive results that low risk low custody individuals are doing well while they're on low risk low custody. You go on to the next slide. So the other outcome we're able to look at least in the preliminary analysis, were the violations. What percent of individuals had at least one violation? And again, you can see the comparison between the low risk low custody and those who weren't on low risk low custody. And you can see a large difference between the two groups. In this case, we're looking at low risk individuals who are on parole, and we can see that those who weren't on low risk low custody, there was very little change pre and post COVID. For those who were on low risk low custody, we do see an increase in the percentage of individuals that had at least one violation. However, within that increase, it's still substantially lower for those who are on low risk low custody. We see 66% compared to 46%. So we still see a large decline for those who are on low risk low custody in terms of their likelihood of having at least one violation. So as we do initial analysis of this, or as we do additional analysis of this, we will look in more detail at the types of violations, not just did they have one, how many did they have? And as I've looked at this initially, we do see that those who are on low risk low custody actually have fewer violations. Even those who do have at least one, the number that they have are fewer. So those who are on low risk low custody, again, seem to be doing better than those who are not, even within risk levels. We go on to the next slide. And again, same information on this slide, just looking at the medium risk individuals. Again, this is the group that Colorado really expanded the number of individuals who were medium risk, who were now eligible for low risk low custody. And we see here, similar to what we saw in the previous graph, that those who were on low risk low custody were much less likely to have at least one violation. For the medium risk, it's about half, both the pre and post COVID. We don't see the same increase for the medium risk individuals. So again, positive results here that we're seeing as Colorado expanded the use of low risk low custody. We see a continued lower rate of violations for those who receive low risk low custody relative to those who did not. And for the medium risk individuals, we don't see an increase, or we see a very little increase post-COVID as the use of low risk low custody was greatly expanded. On to the next slide. Okay, so to summarize, we see a dramatic increase in the use of low risk, low custody beginning in April 2020. If you remember the slide, we went from under 50 in April of 2019 to well over 600 in April 2020. So a very steep increase in the use of low risk, low custody prior to COVID or post-COVID. That increase was primarily driven by those who were medium risk. So there was a small increase for low risk individuals, but the increase was primarily driven by those who were medium risk. We see those who moved on to low risk, low custody were much less likely to be revoked. And this was true across risk levels. If you're low risk, your likelihood of being revoked was actually pretty similar to those who were medium risk, but both were much lower than those who did not receive low risk, low custody, and the decline over time between the two periods was greater for those who were on low risk, low custody. So we see almost a 2/3 reduction in the likelihood of being revoked for those who are on low risk, low custody. And finally, those who are on low risk, low custody were much less likely to have at least one violation while in supervision. Again, all positive results that we're seeing so far in our initial analysis of the use of low risk, low custody. And onto the last slide. So the next steps for this. So the part that is really missing here are the outcomes in terms of, are these individuals committing new crimes and are they returning to prison? And we tried to look at new prison returns, and we only had 6 months worth of data for this part of the analysis. And with that 6 months worth of data, it normally takes longer, especially during a post-COVID period where courts were slower, cases weren't being processed the same way as they were prior to COVID. We weren't really seeing many people in either group return to prison within 6 months. So we're going to look at a full year's worth of prison returns. And again, that data, we're looking through today's date. So it'll take a little bit of time to get that data. And then we're also working with the courts to pull in charge and conviction data so that we can look and say, are these individuals who were on low risk, low custody as well? We didn't look at early discharge in this part of the analysis, but we will be looking at early discharge. Are those individuals who were discharged early, are they more likely to be charged and convicted with new offenses? And if so, what types of new offenses? So we can compare those changes over time, not just in revocation and violations, but into new offenses that are charged through the court system. And then finally, in the fall, we'll be releasing a brief on the findings, and we'll recommend policy and practice and whether or not these changes should be sustained based on the outcome study. Again, so far, things are looking great. The results are again, in the right direction, but we want to look at a longer time period so we can give a more complete analysis. And with that, I will turn it back over to you, Tracy.
Thank you so much, Valerie, Maya, Mike. That was really compelling and interesting information. Before we launch into our well-deserved break, I did just want to briefly acknowledge Representative Amabile, who took time to join us this morning. So I wanted to check in with you, Representative. First of all, thank you so much for joining us, really among your busy schedules. And I wanted to see if there was anything, no pressure at all, if there's anything you would like to share with the group before we go into our break.
I know Representative Amabile is juggling calls this morning, so she may be on, but someplace else.
No problem at all. Thank you so much, Erin. Well, just wanted to acknowledge her and thank you again for making time. So we will have a 5-minute break and then we will reconvene to welcome our panel discussion and discuss policy options that support supervision success. So feel free to turn your cameras off and we will regroup promptly at 10:03. Thanks, everyone. See you soon.
Yeah, I see the Speaker of the House has joined us. So Tracy, maybe we get restarted here in a second. We can kick right off with Mr. Speaker. As long
Absolutely, Aaron, that's perfect timing. Speaker Garnett, thank you so much for taking the time to join us this morning. It's really a pleasure to have you in attendance. We're just welcoming people back from the break. So as people return, just remember to keep yourselves muted. We are recording this event, so turn your cameras on or off, just depending on your own comfort level. And Speaker Garnett, welcome. Do you have anything to share with the group?
Sure, Tracy, thanks so much. And Aaron, thanks so much for the invite. It's great to be with everyone today. I just, everything that you guys are working on is so important. And I just want to recognize all that work and do it on behalf of the people of Colorado. It's an honor to be Speaker of the House. I feel like every day I try to be the speaker for both sides of the aisle, for all 65 districts, really trying to put the institution first and try to kind of leave it better than I found it, because I feel like that's the role of the speaker and it's what the speaker has done in the past. And so, just checking in on gatherings like this is really important, because you guys, there's people from all over the state. And I just wanted to highlight, from those of you who work in both state and local law enforcement and correction agencies, and those who are working to keep our community safe. Thank you for all of your service. It's beyond important. It really is what we all rely on a daily basis. And all of you are coming together to talk through ways for us to reduce recidivism levels, which has always been a policy priority of mine. It's one that Colorado is impacted by in particular. And we need to continue to invest in the progress and wellness of our justice involved in offender population. That's what the data shows. It's common sense. We need to find ways for individuals to not reoffend. It is hard, and there's a right balance. And I understand that's what you guys are working on today. I also want to give a shout out to the members of the House Judiciary Committee. A few of them are participating in some of your panels today. When I was building the Judiciary Committee from the House side, I really thought through, who are some of the hardest working, smartest members of our caucus, because that's who needs to be on the Judiciary Committee. I think for the first time, all Democratic members are attorneys, which is critically important to the issues that come before that committee. The dedication to finding the solutions around all the issues that you guys are discussing today is really challenging, and is one that, especially in the environment that we find ourselves in nationally, makes this group of legislators really, really key to the process. So I just happy to answer any questions. I know you guys have a packed agenda. I really appreciate just the opportunity to check in. Thank you all for your service. Thank you all for taking the time out of that service to have these important discussions today. I look forward to just listening as you guys continue through your agenda for as long as I can before I get pulled into something else. But Aaron, again, thank you for the invite. And for all of you who work directly with Aaron Greco, he's one of the best in the business, and he has my full trust. So Aaron, thanks again, and happy to answer questions or just sit back quietly as you guys continue to work through all of the stuff on your agenda.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Speaker Garnett. We really appreciate having you here and for those words. So our next portion of today's event is we are moving into our panel discussion to discuss policy options that support supervision success. So I would love to introduce my colleague, Laura Vanderloo, who will be facilitating this conversation.
Great. Thank you very much, Tracy. And thank you again, speaker. It was so great to have you transition us back into this conversation. And I think that was a perfect segue and into our collaborative discussion today. And so, Tracy, if you could go to the next slide, that would be great. I think Executive Director Williams set us up so well today for this part of the discussion and describing what we're here to do after taking in all of those great analyses from CJI and thinking about Colorado's parole supervision population and those people and the people who supervise them to come together and have this collaborative conversation around policy. And so, just to sort of pull it all together for us today about really thinking about this as a beginning, as a way to have that honest conversation that Executive Director Williams was talking about, and to really link arms in Colorado around what does current policy look like? What is the experience of that policy in reality for people and for systems and for communities? And then additionally, what could it look like? What should it look like? And so in this about hour and a half that we have to really get into these topics, we're really going to think about how Colorado can really continue these gains that you've seen through the data that you've been experiencing as a state over the past few years, and really engaging stakeholders in a coalition to think about and envision how legislative and administrative policy can link together in a way that both supports people and supports systems to get those successful outcomes to be sustained and to even improve them over time. And so that's really the goal, the crux of what we're here for today. So if everyone could keep that in their back pocket as just, really what we're hoping to accomplish today, then I think we're going to have a fruitful discussion going forward. I'd be remiss to not mention, you see the big image on this slide. This is a document that is published by the Pew Charitable Trusts last year that really is an extremely helpful guide that if our slides weren't cut off at the bottom, which we've desperately tried to fix today, we promise you all that there are wonderful citations for all of these things, but we're happy to send this around so that people can actually explore them on the internet. But this policy package really does give an exceptional amount of practical and applicable policy reforms that are available to states to really support what it can look like to have this policy platform supportive of supervision success in their context. I know today we're really focused on parole, but I truly recommend this as a resource if you're thinking about how to understand where the field sits in terms of practices and research to support those practices. Go to the next slide, please, Tracy. So for the next hour and a half, just like I said, we're going to engage in that collaborative approach that really prioritizes a diverse set of perspectives, experiences, and expertise to interrogate those three dimensions of Colorado's approach to parole supervision. What does current statute and practice look like? What is the experience of those? And what could or should that policy platform look like? And we wanted to take a moment just to say that effective policy, that global notion of what policy is, truly is informed, thought about, conceptualized, and then put into practice with this diverse set of experiences and expertise. Colorado, you're doing a great job even today just coming together. There are 74 people, including our great panelists on this call right this moment. And that demonstrates to us immediately that you're invested in thinking about how should policy be created? How should it be thought about? How should it be amended? And so this wheel gives you a sense of, what we've heard from folks already in developing this event as how Coloradans want to approach this. And we think you deserve a huge kudos for approaching it in this manner. Next slide, please, Tracy. To guide us in our conversation today, we have and are lucky to have and are pleased to have a great set of panelists with those diverse set of experiences and expertise to lead us through our discussion of three policy areas today. And so I was originally going to introduce everyone, but we made a last minute change to ask folks to introduce themselves because we figured you're better at it than I am. So if we could just go alphabetically. And so Colby, that puts you up first. And I'd love it if you could just give us your 2 sentences about who you are and what you do.
Sure, Laura, happy to do that. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Colby Dolly. I am a deputy director with the Crime and Justice Institute. I've been with CJI for about 10 years now, and I am the project director for the 2 projects that presented some preliminary findings today.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm Deborah Duran. I'm the assistant director for the Division of Adult Parole. I currently oversee field operations for the Southern Western Slope and the Specialized Supervision Unit. Thank you for having me today.
Hi, good morning. I'm David Johnson. I'm the director for the Division of Adult Parole. I've been with the department 26 years. Most of that time was spent within the institutions, but in 2017, I had the privilege of being promoted to deputy director with the Division of Adult Parole. And fortunately, Mr. Williams selected me as the director and when he came on. So I have been actively involved in some of this work for the last 26 years, as I said, and the last 4 years with the Division of Adult Parole.
Hi, folks. I'm Kelly Mitchell, and I'm the executive director of the Robina Institute of Criminal Law and Criminal Justice at the University of Minnesota. We do research in probation, parole, and sentencing, and our goal with all of it is to connect research to practice to make transformative change in criminal justice. Thanks for having me.
Good morning, I'm Meredith McGrath. I'm the Deputy Director of Adult Parole, and I've grown up in the system, so I've spent the last 20 years with the department, all of it with the Parole Division. So I look forward to the conversation today.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Richard Morales. I'm the Deputy Executive Director for the Latino Coalition of Community Leadership. We're an intermediary that works with community and faith-based organizations, specifically in Colorado. We're working with the department and communities across the great state to provide reentry services.
Great. Kalina, are you on the line with us?
I am.
Great.
I'm Kalina Rodriguez. I was incarcerated at Denver Women's for 5 years. I successfully completed parole March 31st, 2020. I have been actively helping people re-enter into the community since the day that I went into prison. So I pride myself on helping other individuals going in and coming out. I run a nonprofit, K Project Freedom, that helps people re-enter, and a program called You Are Not Alone that helps mentor individuals that are still currently incarcerated. Thanks for having me.
Great, thank you. And Madam Vice Chair Tipper, are you on the line with us this morning? Perhaps.
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Did you just want me to introduce myself? I'm sorry, I'm driving, so that's part of my problem. No, that's okay.
No problem at all.
So I'm Carrie Tipper. I'm a state representative representing Lakewood, although that could change with the new maps, and I'm a vice chair on judiciary.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for agreeing to be on this fantastic panel with us today and really leading us in the discussion. You do see some text, all of you, cut off at the bottom there. No harm, no foul. That's my name down there. So just as a reminder, I am Laura Vanderlucht. I am a project manager with the Council of State Governments Justice Center, as Tracy introduced me earlier. So Tracy, if you could go to the next slide, please. So just to give everyone a little bit of an orientation as to how our panel discussion is going to flow, I will present just a couple of slides at the beginning of each of our policy options that look just like this one, except they have different content on them to guide us through our 3 different areas of discussion. So this first slide will give some research and then some mechanisms that research and best practice show can help states to implement this type of policy approach. And then I'll give a little bit of context and research and the Colorado context, and then we'll get into our discussion. So here's hoping you hear my voice the least, and our panelists will really dig into this conversation. But so policy option 1, we'll start here. The policy option being limit incarceration for technical violations. And so what the research tells us why we should do this, that incarceration, especially for short periods of time, is destabilizing for individuals. It's destabilizing for communities and families, and it also is costly for the state and the system. And so not only are these disruptions destabilizing for the state, for individuals, but they also tend to undermine public safety because of that destabilization of people's lives and interruption in their employment, their families, their healthcare, all of those forms of destabilization. And so while these higher corrections costs, but also higher human costs are incurred. So what can states do? What are some of the mechanisms from a policy perspective to address or to be able to accomplish limiting incarcerations? Wanting to make sure to examine and interrogate what supervision conditions entail, whether they are mandatory or special conditions, and especially drug testing. Certainly one of the innovative areas we have is thinking about drug testing only when it is indicated by a specific assessment to be individualized to the person. A step to clearly define what a technical violation is, so that there are clear parameters for officers and for systems, and as well as for clients, so that they understand what is expected of them. And then being even more specific, unless there is a direct threat to public safety, because we certainly want to put that at the forefront of our thinking, restrict or eliminate the use of incarceration. There is a spectrum of where a state could go there. And then additionally, limiting arrests and warrants for revocations based on technical violations. And so some different places in the system where you states can interject some of these policy parameters. And then lastly, restricting the length of time that a person can spend incarcerated in response to a technical violation, be that on a hold in a county jail or actually inside of a state prison while awaiting the response or the adjudication of that revocation decision. Next slide, please, Tracy. So again, so this is the flow that we'll take. Just reminding you, you've seen this slide already today. Maya presented this information for us, but just putting it back in the context, bringing it back up for you to look at what has Colorado already done? Where do you sit in this spectrum of this policy option? Started to really reduce in a major way since about 2015, those technical returns for technical violations in context of a new crime. So just having that in your mind as we proceed into the conversation. Next slide, please, Tracy. And then current Colorado law, what does it tell us about the structures that are in place legislatively to give guidance to practice at CDOC for the Division of Adult Parole? So 2 different sections here, and we've highlighted some key components that demonstrate really where Colorado sits in some of those mechanisms. So there isn't a definition of technical violation in legislation. CDOC has a definition of technical revocation that guides them administratively. And then additionally, Colorado does have both a system of intermediate sanctions, and here that's where officers are required to consider all of the available intermediate sanctions prior to the severity of a revocation, before that is an option in response to the behavior of a person on parole. And then Additionally, there is a time restriction in Colorado for how long a person can spend in confinement in the county jail when they have received a technical violation. And right now it stands, you can see the last line there, not to exceed 14 consecutive days or 2 weeks as an intermediate sanction. Next slide, please, Tracy. So here we are for our discussion. And this is where we're hoping to dig into, again, I know we've been talking about it as 3 buckets. For some reason, we decided to make it 2 on the discussion slide for space. But in that current practice side of the slide here, we're really interested in both what is the actual current policy from CDOC, which is why we have our great CDOC panelists to help us understand that. But then also, what is the experience of that practice and of that policy in real life? What are the consequences of it? And then on the red side of the slides here, you'll see this is where we're getting into the shoulds and the coulds. What should this look like? What could it look like for Colorado? And then back to Carl's initial comment at the beginning of today, what are some of the barriers to making those visions come to life? So with that, in this first policy bucket of limiting incarceration for technical violations, we want to start with understanding about condition setting. And so how are conditions of supervision determined currently? And with that, I think we're going to turn it over to CDOC first. And Meredith, I believe you drew the short straw here to kick us off.
Good morning. So this might be the easier of the questions as we roll into the discussion. So conditions for parole supervision are set within statute, and then there's the allowance for individualized conditions to be set as well for our client population based upon their risks and needs. And those are typically done prior to their release through actions with the parole board, where they have an application hearing, discussion, and review. We also have the ability to apply conditions once they come out onto parole if there's either a regressive or progressive need. So if something needs removed because they've achieved it, or if something needs added because maybe an additional risk factor presents itself. I know that there's been a lot of work and a lot of sub-working groups over the last year of really focusing on those individualized conditions and how can we sort of limit the condition setting so that we're really focusing. And the parole board has really taken the lead on that and has been a really great partner in those discussions and certainly an advocate for that. Does that help answer and start the flow?
It does. Thank you very much. And so I'm wondering, initially from a CDOC perspective, what is your vision for how condition setting could work? And I know I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but starting to get us into that thinking of how does the current practice align with your philosophy and your approach to parole supervision?
So I can give you a little bit of historical perspective where there used to be a laundry list of conditions. And so as a supervision officer, we were trying to apply multiple individualized conditions. Somebody might come out with 3 different treatment options. And the ability for somebody to complete 3 different treatment classes while trying to maintain stability in the community was really hard. And so as we've evolved both in policy and in practice, we really try to use the risk needs assessment to drive some of those decisions of what is our focal point and what does this person, and in conjunction with that person, right? That individual has to have a say-so and a choice in this matter as well, to be able to figure out what does that success plan look like for that individual. And so we're really at the, I would say the teenage years right now of being able to work through some of these policies and practices to really make them a full integrated approach. But the ability to make sure that we're not doing this alone and that the client's not doing it alone, the ability to incorporate that community. And I love that Richard is on this call as well, because he and his team have been instrumental in being able to help us really work towards that collaborative approach for what best success can be achieved for that client. As we move forward, the vision is how do we bring that deeper into the facility so that in reach, that connectivity and that community is there while somebody's inside, and that way that bridge is a little bit more smooth as they're transitioning outside. So that's a little bit of the vision setting and what more is to come, I think, with our department and our community partners.
Well, Meredith, thank you very much for what I think was a really effective segue into perhaps some comments from Richard, to think about, from your perspective, how has that collaboration worked with CDOC, and is that in line with what you're seeing in the community?
Yes, so for us, the collaboration has been growing, and that's been incredibly important because we're starting to see things like joint case staffings, joint meetings, kind of creating the ecosystem together, because sometimes it can get really confusing when you're on the outside looking in, and when working with people who are coming out and getting them employed, and then that destabilization effects as they become reincarcerated for the technical violations. It kind of feels like it sets you back. So as you're able to align and really look at what resources does the department have, what resources does community have, how can we bring those together, is going to be an important facet. And also looking from the perspective of sometimes it gets a little confusing as well for community, trying to discern similar people with similar fact patterns. Maybe they're not showing up for the meetings or not complying with certain requirements, but maybe certainly not posing a severe community safety risk. Perhaps they relapsed and they need some additional help. In one instance, we may be able to work through that and actually seek that help and start aligning those resources. And in some instances, that opportunity isn't there. So community is kind of wondering, well, how can we better engage? How can we look at this a little bit differently? How can we align the resources, the modalities, the strategies to really complement what's going on from that community perspective?
If I could jump in here, I'd just like to comment that I think that the Colorado DOC is sort of one thing that you're really doing right is thinking about how risk and needs relate to the conditions that are imposed, right? Because if we think about what we want to happen to a person while they're on parole, we want to protect public safety, we want to protect victims, but we also want to help reintegration with society. And that reintegration for some people requires behavioral change, that we need to think about what treatment or services could we provide to that person to promote behavioral change so that they're not reoffending in the future. And that risk needs assessment is our key to understanding how to unlock behavioral change for individuals. At Robina, we've done some research with a couple of jurisdictions in the Midwest to look at probation conditions and determine if they were aligned at all with the person's criminogenic needs. So criminogenic needs are the factors that relate to reoffending that can be changed with intervention. And we found that when alcohol and drugs, when substance abuse issues were the problem, everybody's very good at recognizing that and addressing that. But when it's things like pro-criminal attitudes or antisocial patterns, those are things you can't pick up on necessarily unless you do that risk needs assessment. It's kind of the hidden thing. And in our jurisdictions, we found that for pro-criminal attitudes, only about half the time was treatment or programming directed at addressing that need. And in only 10 to 20% of the time was it directed at addressing antisocial patterns. So that cognitive behavioral therapy kind of treatment that we need for those issues just wasn't happening. So really taking a look at what the person's risk and needs are, and then thinking about which is, if they've got multiple needs, like Meredith mentioned, which one's really driving criminal behavior, and how can we make sure that we have the treatment or services in place to try to work with that person on that issue. So I just want to commend DOC for thinking about that directly in setting conditions. I think that's where everybody should be going.
And Laura, I'll just quickly add that as part of our CGI's revocation analysis project, conditions is a really big part of that. We are actually in the process of doing a file review, and DOC has been very committed to taking a deeper dive and looking at how their conditions are set and comparing that to the risk and needs assessment of the folks on parole. So we're too early to say exactly what those results will be, but we are taking a really deep dive and looking to see and provide kind of thoughts to DOC about ways that conditions could be more individualized for folks on parole.
Great. Thank you very much. That's really critical context, I think, to then segue us into thinking about what are some of the barriers to putting that approach in practice in Colorado? So sort of shifting into this should, could space. And so I'm interested, perhaps Madam Vice Chair Tipper and Ms. Rodriguez, I would love to hear if it's possible, if in your opinions, the resources exist in Colorado communities to be able to meet those needs of people who are on parole, and what are you hearing and or what have you experienced? Sorry, Ms. Rodriguez, maybe you'd like to go first. I asked two people to talk.
I'm kind of still in that, you got to tell me when to go. I'm ready. I will be honest, DJ, any platform you are on with me, I still get that anxiety of Lord, you are the boss. I have to remind myself I am the boss. I'm in control. I can do this. So he was the warden at DW for the entire time I was there. Well, 1 year short, but it does not matter. He made an impact. Anyway, so I kind of set myself up for my own segue because I've been thinking about this for many years. So my segue was reentry starts the day that you walk into prison, not the day that you leave. I do feel as though that we are getting to a point where these resources are available to have that mentorship of having individuals meet on an individual basis with the mentors to meet with individuals on an individual basis to address what those needs look like. We are all different. We all have different needs. Some of us have substance issues and some of us don't. Some of us have family issues and some of us have no support whatsoever. So how do we dictate what that looks like without having a rapport with an individual? Individually. I think that in my opinion is going to be the key to success is support. And that's going to start within the prisons and coming out to parole and having somebody who is going to tell you that it's going to be okay. Even if you relapse, okay, we all make mistakes. Clearly, Dean Williams said, DOC is not perfect, neither are we. So I, in my opinion, that's where it's at. That is, let's start there. Support with inside the walls, stepping out and having somebody to essentially hold your hand and telling you that if you mess up, come talk to us and we'll figure out what a solution looks like that instead of are you back in prison? Because that's a huge anxiety of if I jaywalk, I didn't cross the street for a long time in fear of having a technicality that I was going to go back to jail.
Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez. I was furiously taking notes while you were talking. I mean, you put such a fine point on so many things. I think I try and use entirely too many words to say most of the time. But really that notion of rapport and of community connections and making those meaningful is being so critical to success. Thank you for holding those up. I think really important in this context of what could this look like. Madam Vice Chair Tipper, I don't know if you wanted to add your thoughts about what you're hearing from the community before we sort of move on to our next policy option here.
Yeah, and I was seriously texting. I'm now parked, so I'm not texting and driving, but I was texting Aaron because I said, "What's my audience here? How candid can I be?" You know, as someone who's been elected, I think of the political side too, which is not lost on you all. I know, you know, you guys just do some incredible work. It obviously goes, it's unappreciated and I think vilified often, which is unfortunate. So one, I think, listen, like, you know, these resources don't exist in every community. And I think my role is trying to continue to empower kind of these community-based organizations so that people have more of these tools. I mean, what Paulina just said to me is sort of fascinating, thinking about this, not as like reentry doesn't start like as you get ready to leave, but like it should be the day that you come in. And I think that's so key and critical for folks to understand. And part of that really represents a big paradigm shift, right? And so kind of segueing into the political side, what is challenging for folks, and I think the speaker mentioned this, we're all lawyers on judiciary, which I think helps, but what's challenging to sort of the layperson is we are combating these, what I think are actually really dangerous narratives about what it means to, one, go to jail, go to prison, who are the people that end up in those places, not recognizing the systems that really land people. Of course, there are individuals that are making autonomous decisions, but so part of, I think, the struggle is dismantling that as much as we can. And so when I think politically, what I really try and do is think about like the safety and efficiency. It is more efficient to actually put the time and effort and energy and political sort of bandwidth into making these changes and empowering, like I said, some of these community organizations, than to just continue doing the same thing, because we know that we're releasing people without the tools that they need, without the support. The nuance, like you said, I think we've gotten a lot better with respect to substance abuse issues. We have, I think, a lot of work to do with respect to mental health, and there's obviously an overlap there, but there are nuances there that we set people up to fail if we don't do more. So unlike Pelly and I used a lot of words to say not very much, but that's sort of what I do as a politician, I guess. But I guess for me, it's been a challenge, because as a lawyer, I think about the law and what makes sense in terms of efficiency, and you try and keep personalities and sort of emotions out of it, and that is just not the reality in the legislature.
Thank you very much. I think that knit together a lot of this discussion around what are the appropriate sanctions and what are the appropriate individualized sanctions for people who are on parole supervision, and how could Colorado re-envision that? I think to understand, Ms. Rodriguez, from your perspective and from the community perspective and from a destabilization perspective, is that proportional? Is that achieving the goals of the state? And is it still maintaining public safety to keep people in the community? And if so, how can we put that at the forefront of our goal for how we respond to these technical violations of parole?
Laura, before we move on, can I just briefly say something real quick, because I hear a number of things that I think is important to come together on. We started the discussion with what is the conditions of parole? And as soon as you say that, you automatically think, how are we supervising? And I think the narrative needs to switch. And you asked philosophically what we need to do and what we tried to do. And I think Kalina did a great job of presenting that. That narrative needs to shift. That lens that we're looking through, community supervision, if you will, needs to shift to community support. And I think that's one thing that we're recognizing slowly but surely within Colorado, is that we need to move from supervision to support. So if there was conditions of support, it wouldn't have some of those very specific supervision tools in it, and it would have more of our community-based partners. It would have more of those assessments to determine how can we help this individual? How can we be the safety net for them to acclimate back into that community in a responsible way without jeopardizing public safety? And so from that standpoint, that is truly our trajectory, if you will, for the Division of Adult Parole. And I know I'm supported by Director Williams in this circumstance, because we've had multiple conversations. So I thought that was pretty important to not leave that hanging out there. So thank you for giving me that opportunity.
Of course. Thank you very much. And Kalina, I see your hand raised.
Yes, I just want to add that in some of these women and men coming out, so my nonprofit, we started a program called You Are Not Alone, going into DW and La Vista and going into Sterling. And it is having curriculum-based reentry and having one-on-one meetings with individuals. Unfortunately, COVID hit and we weren't allowed to go back into the prison. So it was very short-lived, that part of it. However, we still stayed open and we still maintain that support and that connection with individuals. And they know who we are, and we reach out to people, and that we have them reach out to us. Some of these people and women, mostly for me, because I relate with them, because I can't tell a man, oh, it's going to be okay. I don't know if it's going to be okay. My co-founder can tell them that, because he's a man and he did 18 years, and he can tell them that it's going to be okay after war. Me, I can tell women it's going to be okay. And there is a there's a happy place at the end of the road, even though it's hard. So a lot of these women reach out to me, and I could tell you that when they're going to relapse before they relapse and before they know it. I know them like the back of my hands. I know them better than my kids, and my kids probably don't appreciate that, but that's truth. My heart is with them. In my opinion, having a mentor-based program from parole inside of the prisons, because I'm not all about me. I'm not like, oh, K Project Freedom, here we are. I want it to be everybody. I want there to be enough people for everybody. So to have a program based out of parole, whether it be paid, whether it be volunteered, whatever that looks like, to develop something out of parole, to go into the facilities and do something, I think is going to be a game changer.
Thank you very much. I think certainly your experience, mirrors that of what the research says, and everything of best practices for how to best facilitate that process of leaving incarceration and staying out. And what does that actually take from a supportive social structures and community structures perspective. So thank you so much. I am going to move us into the second policy option. I'm loving the robust conversation. Thank you all so much for adding your expertise to this. Before I do, I did want to recognize that we have Representative Lindsay Doherty joined us. So thank you very much for joining the call. We've been giving our elected officials a chance to provide any comments they would like to. If you wanted a few moments, we're happy to give them to you. If not, I'm happy to keep rolling.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm just happy to listen in. I did mostly criminal justice juvenile bills this first session. So just happy to listen and learn. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks for joining. Okay, so our second, I'm hearing from my team in my ear, not actually in my ear, but on Slack, that Representative Mike Weissman is also here. So same to you, if you'd like to provide any comments.
Thank you. And, like Lindsay, with whom I served on judiciary this year, I'll keep it short. I'm really just here to listen and apologize in advance for hopping on late, and I'm not sure I'll be able to stay all the way till 12. I'm juggling a couple of things this morning, but I just appreciate the interest in this subject. I think this year I did my 5th record sealing and collateral consequences bill in my 5 sessions. I've definitely taken a strong interest in promoting successful reentry. In a variety of settings, I always say, look, we want one goal. I think whatever we disagree on, one goal we should be able to agree on is we want everybody's present intersection with the system, whether it's their first or more than the first, to be the last. So anyway, thanks. I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chairman. Really appreciate you taking the time, as well as you, Representative Doherty, and your dedication to these issues in Colorado. So policy option 2, to build off of our discussion of what it takes to be successful in Colorado on supervision and how can the system support people best in that. So here the policy option is to provide incentive time for compliance on parole supervision to achieve discharge more quickly. So here we've already reviewed a lot of really great Colorado specific data that gets to the meat of this issue, which is, first of all, having really large populations of people on parole supervision for a really long amount of time is an ineffective use of resources, and it is also onerous on the person and their family and their community who is trying to accomplish that supervision. So it's an ineffective use of people and state resources all the way around. Second, you've seen a lot of great information today about when reoffending for a new crime or when revocation for technical violation occurs in someone's parole supervision tenure, if you will, or time on supervision. And we know that you saw that great graphs from CJI, and I'm going to show it to you again in just a moment, that it's that 6 months is that peak of where the most revocation happens. It's not 3 years down the line. It's not 10 years down the line. It's in that first 6 months, or it's in that first year. And so what can the system do to support people in that first time period on supervision? So then the flip side of that is that supervising people longer than that year tends to have a diminishing return on investment, right? And that you're not effectively using your resources. And then lastly, that having an approach to parole supervision that focuses on incentives and goal setting as opposed to sanctioning and refereeing behavior is a much better way to make sure that people reach their goals and that they're meaningful goals for individuals. So tying in our individualized conversation from condition setting, it's the same for case planning and case management. If you are, just like Kalina was saying, meaningfully integrating people in an individualized and tailored way into their supervision, then they are more likely to build that rapport and to want to meet those goals that are set. So then how do you do that as a state? You institutionalize, you codify your reinforcement of positive achievements towards supervision goals as the core philosophy of supervision. And then you shorten supervision sentences. And you can do that through a variety of mechanisms, through revocation caps, through earned time, through earned discharge, through demonstrating compliance, and of course, always keeping public safety and the safety of victims, if they do exist in this person's case, at the forefront of your approach. So next slide, please. Again, here's some of that research that you saw from CJI. Trends in successful parole completions and the utilization of early discharge, which does exist in Colorado, you have that mechanism already, has already started to increase. And so that shows us that the approach that parole supervision is taking is going in this incentive-based direction, but can and should it be increased is one of the questions on the table. So next slide, please. Current Colorado law. This is an example of this, excuse me, I got my slides mixed in my head just for a moment there. Applies the same approach for positive behavior in prison as it does for people on parole. And so there isn't a separate standard for what that earned time capacity looks like for a person who's incarcerated versus a person who's supervised in the community. So one example of a place in legislation where you might want to think about, is that in line with current practice? Next slide, please. So here's our discussion. So really what we're trying to get into with this policy option is, what does an incentive-based approach to parole supervision in Colorado look like? And should it include some sort of mechanism that is data-driven, is driven by the experience of being on parole in Colorado, and looks at how to best and most effectively allocate resources to achieve the most successful exits, completions from parole as possible. So I'm going to start with current practice. And I think, Deb Duran, if I can start with you to talk about the incentives that are currently available for people on parole supervision.
Sure, thank you. I think I just really want to start with the fact that that we're really moving into a coaching model. So, the coach versus referee. And so when we look at different incentives, we have a number of incentives, but I think first and foremost, it's really critical that our officers are really engaged in that process. And so when we're looking at incentives, we definitely have a partnership with our wages partner and having community support. And I hear Kalina loud and clear that it is really essential to have that community support when we're taking a look at different incentives. So in terms of current incentives, we have a number of incentives when we work with our wages partners to ensure that our client is successful and that they eventually will get to the point of discharge. And so we offer a number of incentives that really include some financial assistance, working tools, boots, clothing to ensure that they're successful with employment, educational and vocational programs, transportation. We offer a number of those items that will really support their transition, housing assistance, ensuring that there's some stabilization built into the plan. Again, personal eye hygiene items. We take a look at low risk, low custody, looking at that administrative caseload and determining whether or not we can progress them into the supervision. And again, the earn time, taking a look at early discharge policy allows for us to, based upon completion of programming in the community, we can move them into or we can award some additional time. And then furthermore, with our officers, we have a number of programs where our officers are really engaged in that process, working with our clients out in the field. We have
From
officers
Justice Center, Council of State Governments. This is DOC talking about their success in reducing recidivism.
Great. Thank you. Someone piped in there for just a moment. You maybe thought you were on mute, but you did in fact indicate who was talking. So thank you. Deb, back to you.
Okay, I'm sorry. I think I lost where I was, but I think we could certainly move on.
Great. Thank you very much. Oh, David, I just saw you come off of mute.
Well, one thing I wanted to recognize Deb and her team. I think that slide says a lot about what focus, who we should be focusing on. And when we cross that path about low risk, low custody and who we should be supervising, that was given to Deb as a project to really dissect that and determine what we should do with that. And I think what we've recognized is ultimately what we want to do is to get out of people's way when we don't need to be in their way. And I think you see the results in particular as it relates to the incentives of being on low risk, low custody and moving automatically to that early discharge. I know that Heather Salazar worked with Chad Dilworth, who is on the parole board, to really revise our policies about when people can be put in for early discharge. I know that there's goodwill to even go further with the idea that, yes, let's get out of people's way so that they can get on with their lives. And when they need support, that's what we and our community-based partners are there to support them through that. But from an incentive standpoint, you can give things to people. But a lot of times it's just about helping them get out of the system and moving on with their lives. And Deb's team has done a great job with that.
I'd like to jump in real quick. For me, when Deb was talking about, from the referee to the coach, these are things that we're seeing in community. I mean, when we're actively engaging, with the Division of Adult Parole, with Department of Corrections as a whole, this is a significant cultural change, and this isn't easy. So we see leadership really and being sincere about asking, what does this look like? What can we do better? What can we do different? And that is the honest conversation. I just really wanted to underscore that because none of this really works unless you have those elements present. So I just want to give the department a lot of credit for that because sometimes I think we just don't hear it enough.
Thanks, Richard. You read my mind. I was just about to queue you up to hear where you think some of the challenges still are for DOC. And Kalina, I think I would love to hear from you as well as someone with this lived experience of whether the incentives that are currently available or even the approach of an incentive-based approach that Richard was just talking about too, if that's coming through in real life, or what is the experience day to day?
Oh, it's coming through. It's definitely coming through loud and clear. Normalization is real. People are seeing the change. And I think that's the biggest incentive that individuals can have is to actually see it. Because we hear about it all day long. We hear about what the what ifs and the shoulda, woulda, couldas and all that fun stuff that people talk about. But the fact that people are talking about it and being about it is what people are noticing. So they see the change. They want the change. They want to be a part of the change. And it's rampant. People see it. People are, for example, UAs, people for me, y'all were wasting your money on me. I'm passing every single one, period. I'm going in there. I'm going to do good. It didn't matter if I was on parole or not. I was doing good with being on parole or not being on parole. But you take away one of the UAs a month, and that's already incentive enough. When you put that out there and somebody gets taken off of their 4 UAs and then they knock it down to 3 UAs, that's a win. With 2 UAs, that's a win. So those small incentives are being recognized. These huge ones are absolutely being recognized. Getting off a year, 2 years early, I mean, it's everybody's talking about it. Everybody wants to be off of parole. Everybody wants to start a new life, and they want a clean slate. And in my opinion, people are recognizing it, and DOC is doing it.
That's a really fantastic PSA, Kalina. I feel like, certainly really exciting to hear that. I'm wondering if just from anyone's perspective, really, DOC or other folks, where are some of the challenge areas still? Where is it still sticky? Where can some of the improvements be made?
So I want to echo what Richard was saying as it relates to that culture shift, right? Our ideas are always going to move, and I'll just quote DJ on this one, right? Our ideas are going to move faster than the larger body of culture. And so I think that is still an opportunity for us. And as we continue to layer this into the fabric, that's what is really important. I also think that one of the things that we've done in the last 2 years, which is something that we had not done, was bringing lived experience to the table and hearing that voice and valuing that voice. And that is something that is huge. And frankly, I think we learned that from Richard's shop, right? Because that is something that is heavily embedded within Latino Coalition, as well as the Wage Use Partners. And the credibility, the relatability, and just the honest conversations that can happen when lived experience is at the table really is going to help us challenge what we're doing right now to get to a better space. And so I just wanted to make sure that is understood by the larger audience of just the value of having that in any future decision making, any future forward steps.
And to the extent that you all need legislative action, that could not be more important. I don't know if 10 years ago we would have had the experience of someone who's been through the system really guiding policy or helping and making meaningful contributions to policy. But so that in and of itself, I think, is exemplary of sort of the progress. But at the legislature, personal stories really changed, like I said, hearts and minds. And I had a mentor when I was running for office, said to me that change moves at the speed of relationships. And I've really taken that to heart. And I think that's true, particularly in this space. As I said kind of earlier, we hear a lot of the content is ripe for abuse, right? Like, these are dangerous people, and why are we making any investments? And then when you actually meet these incredible individuals who have transformed their lives, given the opportunity to do so, and then help to change other people's lives, it does change hearts and minds at the Capitol. So I think that is a critical piece to the larger policy changes that involve legislative action.
Laura, this is Dean. I wonder if I could take executive privilege and just comment on Madam Vice Chair. Thank you so much for your comments. Really, this one area, and I know we don't have time to go through all of the data and the politics around this, just one policy consideration. I'll just share this with you though, and I know my friends at CSG and CJI know it better than I do, which is the one area of providing predictability on parole, that if you do well and you do everything you're supposed to do, means that you get equal time or you get incentive to get off earlier versus the knuckleheads who are getting in trouble on parole and doing all that, causing us trouble. And making a distinction, there's the research on this is so solid that if you provide meaningful incentives about getting off early on parole at strategic times, right? That if you do this, guess what? Your parole is shortened on a 1-for-1 basis, for example. And many other states have done this. Both, I'll just say this quite frankly, both conservative and quote unquote liberal states, or both states have done it because they've realized the results are better. That you actually provide, you're actually increasing safety in the community, right? When you have predictable rewards for good performance. That's the way we raise our kids. That's the way we do this in the family. You do well, you get this, right? This way, why you get a promotion if you do well. That really applies with parolees as well. And that's why I'm so glad to have Kalina on and other people with real life experiences who are in the system, because we know from them as well, they'll tell us the same thing. If I knew that by doing well, I get a guaranteed reward and I get off earlier and I accomplish that thing, then you've really done something. And so I'll go back to my quiet place, but I just really wanted to say thank you for this very important conversation, Madam Vice Chair, because this is one of those things that I hopefully will cut across lines to say, no, this is about better results and improved safety, because doing this one thing really incentivizes the good parolees versus kind of the knuckleheads who aren't getting it. And you really make a distinction there. And that makes fundamental sense to even the sort of skeptical folks who maybe don't really see the research or the data that we do. So with that, I'll mute myself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director. I think that really puts a fine point on this too. And Kalina, I do see your hand, and I'm hoping I can add a little bit of a prompt to your comments and ask you to work in an answer to what you already want to say. Sorry. Yeah, wondering if you would work in talking about the access to and availability of meaningful incentives for people on parole, and just thinking through, are the incentives that are currently available, as meaningful as perhaps, being able to be discharged early?
So thank you, Dean, for bringing that up. And yeah, it actually does work hand in hand with my comment that I'm going to say. One, it kind of hit a chord for me about individuals, other people looking at ex-incarcerated people in some type of way. And one of the biggest incentives that I have, and I can speak for several other people who are participating in things like the panels and reentry, is going back into the prisons. Being able to go back in and speak on their behalf and telling their stories and their lived experiences is by far, in my opinion, bigger than getting off of parole. Being able to have that light at the end of the tunnel. I've seen tons of people not want to go or not go back to prison because they want to mess up or they want to get high, but because they want to see people they haven't seen that they lived with for 20 years. People that they love, families that they created inside the walls, whether it's their best friend or somebody who their mentor that helped them guide and become a woman or man that they are today. So that, in my opinion, is one of the biggest ones. And I think that has been astronomically beneficial to people's success inside the prison and outside of the prison. I keep going every single day because I don't want to let the women down that I preach to and say that you can do this.
Thank you so much. That's such a critical context to hear, because I think, just as we hear Vice Chair Tipper and others and Meredith McGrath saying, that perspective and the expected understanding, what does it mean to have meaningful incentives? That there's only one population of people we can ask about that, right? And that we need to do that asking. And it needs to inform where we're going. And so I'm starting to have a bit of a cue from some of our panelists. So I'm gonna do my best to manage. Colby, I think, would like to jump in next, and then Richard.
Great, yeah, thanks, Laura. I wanted to go back to some of the points that Dean brought up in terms of the research that supports the use of an expanded incentive policy. And I think the data that we presented earlier really kind of paints this picture in terms of when individuals are most likely to violate and be revoked on supervision. So the point that the dean, of course, was making, right, expanded use of incentives will make sure that the folks that are already complying get off of supervision through kind of an expanded earn time policy, and those that really need additional services and support, that the caseloads allow officers to focus their time and resources on that. So again, just want to connect it back to the data point that we presented earlier and the really Colorado specific data that supports an expanded use of that policy.
Fantastic. Thank you, Colby. And I think that's such an important reminder for Coloradans and people who are attendees and thinking about this is this policy option in particular, not to say the others are excluded from that, but there is really fantastic evidence to suggest and to have a data-driven policy that could be implemented, measured, understood how it progresses over time, and have some performance metrics around it too. So for those of us in the CSG CJI nerd camp can get behind that line of thinking pretty easily. Great, wonderful. And then Richard, you would like to come in next, and then I have Kelly after that.
I did want to speak to, you'd asked about barriers to maybe some of the policy options. And I can tell you with the Latino Coalition, you know, we're the lead agency for the National Reentry Workforce Collaborative, which is a large group of intermediaries across the country. We cover 40 different states and 2 territories. And when I look and reflect, I just think how lucky we are in Colorado to have such an incredible partner and the leadership that we're seeing. And sometimes what I would just caution is sometimes bad things happen, and not to villainize the department or, you know, put them in a position where they have to kind of take a step back from some of these great and innovative things that are happening, because they start asking, well, why did you do that? And so they start looking at the exception and not the whole of seeing this as effective public policy. So just looking for ways that in those instances that we can support that way the Department of Corrections doesn't feel alone in some of those moments, I think is important in really keeping these things and the innovation alive.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, I think that perspective too, and understanding what it does take and what it takes to have mutual accountability between all of the different coalition members who are invested in this type of success. You know, I think that that's a really important reminder and guide for going forward, as this is the beginning of these conversations, and certainly, hopefully, not the end. Now I wanted to go to Kelly, and then we'll probably transition to the third policy option unless anyone else has a burning desire.
So I just wanted to underscore what Director Williams said about how there is a very strong research base for this idea that incentives are meaningful practice within probation and parole. And you know, what the research that has been mostly done within the past decade. And there's a couple of things we know from it. Number one, we know that a ratio of 4 incentives to 1 sanction is most effective at promoting behavioral change. Again, that's what we're after here. We're trying to help people successfully reintegrate into the community. And so you really have to have a lot more incentives to sanctions. That's what's meaningful, because it's a positive reinforcement. When you're doing things well, you want to reinforce that they are doing the things that they should be doing to move towards success, right? So that's the first thing that we know solidly from the research. We also know that what the incentive is matters, and it has to be something that's meaningful to the individual. And Eric Woldall is really the researcher who's led the way on this front and has actually done some of this research here in Colorado by surveying people on probation to figure out, you know, given the list of incentives, what are the things that would motivate you to really comply with supervision, to do the things that we're asking you to do. And by far, the early discharge option, the ability to earn time off, was the most meaningful thing, incentive to the folks who answered that survey. And we've seen that you know, play out over and over again in other states where early discharge has actually been implemented. We're seeing that people are able to successfully get through their term of probation. In Missouri is the place where they've done this research most recently. that, there's no change in public safety. There wasn't a higher recidivism rate when people were released early from probation. So, more incentives, making sure that there is that ability to earn time off. Incentives can be a range of things, right? It's also the relationship between the parole officer and the person on supervision. So the parole officer can implement incentives in small ways every day by just providing that praise, telling the person that they've done something right, reducing the number of UAs, like Kalina said, maybe even reducing the frequency of reporting. For every smaller incremental thing that the person is able to achieve, you can implement smaller incentives. But overall, the big, gain is when you say, but then if you continue this pattern, you're going to earn time off sooner and be able to transition back to the community fully sooner. That's the thing that's most meaningful to people, and that's what research has shown.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and for really and Colby, I think we've done it. We've done it in this discussion. We had that diverse set of perspectives and experiences to inform, where this could go. And so here's hoping we can carry that into policy option 3. I'm keeping an eye on the clock and promise not to keep people past the break here in about 10 minutes. So policy option 3, we have, and it's perhaps unsurprisingly, because all of this is interconnected in terms of effective parole supervision, but we've talked about some themes that are in here already today. But this last policy option really centers on what is the approach and the philosophy of parole supervision overall, and what does current practice and best practice and research show is the most effective. And then also, and importantly, are we starting with the lens of the lived experience of being on parole supervision and having that inform and define our practices and innovations and new ways of thinking going forward? And so looking at effective, so why? What does the research say? Effective supervision practices, very much in line with what Kelly was just talking about for us, can result in a more efficient use of resources and also those successful completions of supervision. There's a couple of key approaches in supervision of focusing your highest intensity resources on those who are assessed as the highest risk, right? The risk principle, risk, need, responsivity. A lot of us are really familiar with those concepts who've been working in and around criminal justice for the past couple of decades. But there are some important innovations and important nuances to a risk, need, responsivity model that are, if you want to think about it as sort of R&R 2.0, then that's a helpful framework, but really starting to focus on a strengths-based approach as opposed to a deficits-based approach. How can we work on building the self-efficacy and the human agency of people who are on supervision to say, hey, these are your strengths, and we're going to use that as the basis on which we build a successful campaign on supervision. And we're going to work together on those criminogenic needs, on those deficits, without calling them that, to be able to make sure that those strengths carry you through. And so it's a shift in approach, it's a shift in perspective, and it's also a shift in values and an organizational culture. And so the mechanisms through which a state can adopt these are certainly through administrative policy and practice. But in Colorado in particular, I was gonna skip over my last bullet here, but it's super important, and want to say that this is where having those really well-defined and prioritized relationships with community-based service providers is crucial to having this kind of approach, because DOCs, Departments of Corrections, can't go this alone. This is, we didn't sort of DOC our way into this, and we're not going to DOC our way out. And so if we go to the next slide, please, Tracy. Again, just to remind folks of some of the data that CJI analyses they've showed us support some of this, right? Looking at time to revocation again. And next slide, Tracy, please. The distribution, again, when are people, being revoked, thinking about that, prioritizing, and when you have your most intensive services and for whom and at what time during their supervision. Next slide, please. And supervising according appropriately to risk, right? That I think a lot of us know on this call, but for those who may not, that if you over supervise people who are low risk, right, then you often will be augmenting their risk and finding that you have, you know, inappropriately allocated your resources, as well as, you know, had the opposite intention, and that there will be perhaps more violation behavior or criminal behavior as a result. The next slide, please. So what I was talking about with the approach, and that a lot of this third bucket really relies on the philosophy of supervision in Colorado. In Colorado law, you have what are called these statements of legislative intent that exist in various places in your statutes. And what they amount to essentially is the philosophy for the next given section. And there are a variety of these that apply to parole practices. And what you're seeing here are the legislative intent statements of legislative intent for parole release and for revocation. And so here, we're showing this to give you an example of, there are some places in your legislation that allow you to sort of wax philosophical and say, what do we intend for this piece of our practice? And so it's potentially a place, again, to marry together your vision with your practice. Next slide, please. So here we are at the discussion again. These are really broad questions on purpose. So apologies in advance, but at least our panelists saw them beforehand, so they knew what was coming. So what we're really interested in understanding is how and if is supervision people-centered now, and what should be considered moving forward in order to make supervision more people-centered in Colorado. So with that, let's see. Sorry, I'm coming back to my list here. I think, Meredith, we haven't heard from you in a minute, so I might put this to you first to get us kicked off.
You bet. So currently how our supervision is people-centered, it's our growth into our specialized caseloads. And so I'll use the example of those clients that were convicted of a sex offense. This year, one of our big division projects was the development of a statewide supervision team. And the first thing they did was change the name, because the name was not people-centered. It was the Sex Offender Supervision Unit is what it was originally known as. And so now it's the Specialized Supervision Unit. And then they attacked the policy to make sure that there was person-centered language. And then they looked at the approaches to make sure that we weren't just saying big scary because of a conviction, but we're actually looking at the actual risks of that person. And so that was a big cultural change within our approach to supervising those clients convicted of a sex offense. We also even allow for the ability for them to move to a low risk, low custody, which was a big step for us because that was a population that historically had been excluded. So that's one example. We also have what we call the gender responsive program, which is where we really target the supervision support needed for our female population. And that's in collaboration with community partners, as well as on the inside. We also worked towards place-based supervision. And so there's such a barrier for somebody to come in on a report day: transportation, timeliness, employment, and it really was centered on the system and not on the individual. And so a big focus for this year as well was moving our team towards a place-based supervision where they're meeting the client where they're at and really not trying to make that meeting really be more about the support needed in the community versus that surveillance and compliance. And so old model of parole was very much surveillance and compliance driven. Checking the box. Did you succeed? Did you not succeed? And we have amazing staff that interact really well with the client. So I certainly don't want this to sound like our staff are not at the table doing this good work, but our philosophy was very different historically. And so as we shift into that new philosophy of moving from that referee of just blowing the whistle on violations to that coach model of support, right? And a coach can still bench. Sometimes that's a necessary part of coaching, but a coach also works on those strengths of a team to see how we can move forward to success. And success looks like somebody earning their way off of parole sooner than what their sentence looks like. Somebody moving off of parole with the tools and the support that they needed because there's a community of support to do it. And so, again, I'll use this analogy again. We're kind of in those teenage years, right? There's a lot of awkward growing going on right now and a lot of awkward conversations. And so that's where we're kind of moving. And we can't give enough shout outs to the community support that we have as we continue to grow forward in that model. So thank you.
Great. So to sort of come in on some of those challenges and those awkward teenage growing, I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about where some of those challenge areas are in terms of growth areas that other coalition members could join in on your growth process. So maybe I'll ask for an outside perspective, and sorry to put you on the spot, Richard, but wondering if you maybe have some insight into what some of the challenge areas are from a more community-based perspective.
I think the challenges are really in that growth portion. So, you know, it's understanding a system that sometimes from the outside looking in doesn't make any sense. It's a different language. It's a different worldview of approaching, you know, reentry and the work. But we're finding over time that gap is closing. It's narrowing more and more because we're having this trustworthiness that's happening in between community and a department. And that trustworthiness is really comprised of competence, meaning that we're all doing the job that we're intending to do. We follow through what we say we're going to do. And the character piece of really showing up in this space where it's truly collaborative. It's truly having those difficult conversations. And as you know, Director Williams talked about earlier, that honesty, that's a really difficult space to operate in if you don't have that trust. So in looking at all of these different factors and the direction that it's going, I feel like, you know, we've got a really good grounding to tackle a lot of the issues that we're seeing. And some of it is forced upon us, the department and the community, and we're kind of navigating through those things. And some of it is of our own creation. And so we have to address that and navigate through those things. And just as, you know, we said the department doesn't get it right, the community doesn't get it right. But what is a very apparent to me is that we're better together. That when we really get in that lane and communicate and collaborate in that way, it really serves as a better outcome for the people we're serving.
Great, thank you very much. And so a couple of elements of this is truly, you know, think back to some of the themes that I was talking about in that first slide, which is time on supervision, some of the constraints around mandatory length of supervision in Colorado, which you have, you know, various levels for, and certainly the longest of which is for people who have committed sex offenses. And so I'm wondering, if we could all just sort of live in that space for a minute in this conversation around whether those sort of mandatory benchmarks are something that Colorado would be willing to examine. And so I guess maybe if Representative Tipper, if you wanted to kick us off with that, what your perspective as a legislator.
Oh, sure. I mean, I have the perspective of, some of you probably know, having led a colossal failure on trying to do some SOMB reforms this year, which we'll continue to work on next year and the year after. So some of this, I think if I could speak candidly, let me rephrase it. So one perspective that I thought was interesting, and this was the first time I sort of understood the Colorado District Attorney's their opposition in a different way, is one of the DAs said to me, you know, when we sit down with victims, in order to get them to participate in the prosecution, we have to do a lot of work. And part of that work is saying, if we're successful at getting a conviction, this person will, you know, have will be subject to this sentence. This person will have to register. This person will have mandatory supervision for this length of time. And so that was kind of interesting perspective, because for me, instead of just being like, no, these are dangerous people that are incapable of redemption and we're opposed to any sort of change, that was a more nuanced reaction, which I could appreciate. So the answer to your question, I think, is there are folks that are amenable to it. I think it goes back to what I said earlier, is that we have to make a strong case for increasing efficiency, cost savings, and ultimately safety in the community. And I think the data shows that. And then the way to do that is sort of telling the stories and changing hearts and minds. And I think it's a marathon. It's certainly not a sprint. I know you didn't ask this, but I think what my concern is in the most sort of politicized spaces, and you mentioned sex offenders, and that's certainly one of them. I think that is actually an area that needs probably some of the greatest reforms, but is just politically not feasible, speaking candidly. And so my concern is, do we move forward with some of these changes and exempt that population, because that's what we have historically done. And so we've made that problem worse, in my estimation. So I don't have a great answer other than to say, you guys know this, I think it's an uphill battle. But if we could show success, I think that we can make a compelling case. And opposition politically comes from, the political sides, right? So if we can, not neutralize, is not the right word, but sort of convince them of the data, then I think, and this goes for both sides, it's not just one or the other, right? Then I think we have a fighting shot.
Thank you very much. I think that that's such an important reminder. It's kind of fun for us on Team CSG. I don't know for CJI for you as well. We use the phrase changing hearts and minds a lot to talk about our work. So to hear that reflected in your comments and in this context, I think is really important reminder in that the data play an important role, the experiences play an important role, and it really does just come into that holistic coalition of information, not even just of people, but the coalition of information to be able to go into that kind of conversation and have it honestly, I think is so important to hold up. So thank you very much for that. I think also, thank you, Christy, for reminding us in the chat that the Sentencing Reform Task Force of the CCJJ is looking at statutory length of sentencing on parole. And so I have also sort of within the chat function, I'm doing a little bit of an off-panel shout out to Kristen Hilke here, who has agreed to give us some brief comments about approach and philosophy of parole from the parole board's perspective. So Kristen, thank you very much for agreeing to give some commentary.
Yeah, no problem. Hi, good morning, everybody. My name's Kristen Hilke, and I think that along with some of the push for reform that's happening in several agencies, I think starting with the Hickenlooper administration, there was motivation of professionalizing the board, and that in the past, oftentimes, the board would have political appointments that maybe did not have as much knowledge of the criminal justice system. And Governor Hickenlooper started it, and then Governor Polis continued, where what they are looking for is professionals that have been in the criminal justice system for a period of time that has good broad knowledge, overall knowledge of the system. And if you look at the parole board collectively, we have over 250 years in the criminal justice system. And they come from law enforcement. We have prior law enforcement, chief of police, a prior sheriff, a prior jail commander. But in addition to that, we have a PhD in research. We also have somebody that did competency in her past career. And my vice chair has a degree in forensic science, and he's been very active within the criminal justice system. And so I think, having said that, probably now more than ever, the board really is looking at risk, need, and responsivity. And I think all of those three things have to go together. I think that we are doing a great job on identifying what risks and needs are. If I could say, you know, one of the challenges that we have is where's the responsivity? And that one of the things that concerns me is that if we start focusing on terminating people from parole early, are they getting their risks addressed? Are interventions been in place, and has that person had the time to participate in that intervention in hopes that if it's COG-based, and I know that Ms. Mitchell talked a lot about how her agency really looked at cognitive-based treatment and how people think about things, because obviously you're not born a criminal, you learn to be a criminal, and so you can certainly unlearn to be a criminal. And so one of the things that I want to assure that happens is when you look at research around treatment, oftentimes the research does tell you that you do it over an extended period of time. And so if we're going to require treatment as an intervention for people, I think that has to be taken into consideration when we look at early parole discharge, because really the board is quite hesitant to early discharge somebody if they haven't completed what the board ordered them to do. And so that's definitely a challenge for us. And I think the other challenge that exists is there's kind of a black hole, if you will, from institutions to parole. And I think you guys stepping up and getting community members involved to assist with that is fantastic. But I think, you know, the parole board looks at assessments that institutions does, and based on that, we create conditions of parole, and we try to minimize those conditions because we don't want to overwhelm somebody. But what information are we getting from institutions when that person does go out onto parole? And what information could start to be provided that may be of more benefit? So I'm really excited about the direction that the parole board is going. I think that we have a lot of work to do, because despite our growth, we haven't had the capacity or the support behind it. So I think that I'm really excited about moving forward and continuing to collaborate with DOC, as is the rest of the board.
Great. Thank you so much for that perspective. I think it was really informative and interesting, and in the spirit of getting all of our multiple perspectives in. And I know that I have a couple folks in the queue. Before I cue them in, I think we've been chatting on our side, and at the risk of offending people, we're not going to have the break. We're just going to roll on through and then potentially end early as we're coming up against our timeline here. So thank you for your patience with that, and apologies for the change. But I think we have Deputy Director Ruth Kaufman to give brief couple comments, and then Chairman Weissman, I'll go to you.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, I want to just say, as we kind of transition into more of this discussion period, I've really appreciated the comments from the community. It is so gratifying to hear that some of the really hard work that DJ and Meredith have been doing on parole has actually been reflected from the community. I mean, that has just made my day, my week, my month. It's been a really long, hard year for us, and we often reach out to community or people on parole to try to get a perspective, and typically we don't get a good report card, to be frank. So to just hear, to kind of see in the data that, like, wow, we are really making progress. And then also to hear from folks like, you know, you're not there yet, but like you're heading in the right direction. You're getting towards the finish line, I think is, and then to hear from legislators, we're with you.
like, how can we help? I think to me has just been, I'm very inspired by this. So I don't know if there's questions that we didn't deal with. I wanted to make sure, Glenn, that, there was a question about kind of new crimes going up while technicals went down. And that wasn't my impression from those slides. And I don't know if we want to bounce back there, Laura, if it's possible. I'm sorry, I didn't know what else
That's
we're doing
I
right now.
would very much like to do that. Could we pause? We have the Chairman Weissman would like to add a perspective about parole, and then I am happy to dive into questions.
Thank you, Laura, and sorry, I feel like I'm sort of putting us out of order now, but backing up a few comments ago to Carrie, my colleague, and her very difficult tale about trying to take on the law about sex offenses this year. I was going to share a somewhat happier story from kind of my first term. It goes to parole, length of parole, and ability to make changes there. Some folks are familiar here. We have an interim committee process in Colorado, and there was one created on sentencing reform for the interim period in summer of 17, between the 17 and 18 sessions. I had the chance to serve on that, and it was really a deep dive into a lot of law and data about many aspects of the correctional system. That was where I first started to encounter in a deep way the data that we all alluded to earlier on just powerfully showing if somebody is going to recidivate, they're going to do it early. DOC's own data in their annual reports shows that. I mean, I looked at year after year after year, and the correlation is equally strong. I haven't looked at other states, but I imagine it's there. So, we were politically, we were a split chamber or legislature at that point. The blue party had a majority in the House, smaller than it is now. The red party had a majority in the Senate. So you had to have bipartisan support for anything that was going to get done. Going into that session, which begat a particular bill that I'm thinking of, the law in Colorado was that you could serve up to 5 years parole for an F2 or a 3, and obviously the data wasn't very strong to the efficacy of those 4th and 5th years. So in that split chamber environment, we were able to get a bill done to make the maximum tail 3 years for almost all cases. There's a subclass of F2s that ended up having to remain at 5 years. And my Senate sponsor, interestingly, was termed out now, but he was one of the very most conservative members of the Senate, I think coming from both a physical perspective and a faith perspective. So as to the former, he was not a fan of government efforts that did not bear fruit and cost taxpayer dollars. And as to the latter, he was somebody who deeply believed in redemption and second chances coming from the perspective of his faith tradition. And I think in any discussion here, I mean, I came at that from a standpoint of data, and it spoke about as powerfully as any data could in a politically fraught environment. But as Carrie pointed out, I mean, politics and relationships are usually the sufficient condition, even if data is the necessary one. And those were just some angles of what I think helped get that change done in a way that really wasn't all that controversial at the end of the day, and in a bipartisan and necessarily bipartisan way. So just, where this discussion is happening in other states, we're in a policy and data-centric space here, but I think those other things, have gotten some work done here. They will continue to get some work done here in Colorado, and I think should be borne in mind elsewhere too. That's all I wanted to share.
Thank you very much. I think hearing that legislative process along with story perspective is also so critical to this conversation, because as Ruth just mentioned, it's so encouraging from her perspective to hear legislators say, we're with you in this. We hear you, we're listening, we're ready to take action, but action that is, focused, that is targeted, and that collaboratively through all of the perspectives on this phone call and elsewhere, are really in lockstep on. And I think that this year, for all of its this year and a half, gosh, time, for all of its challenges, has really just sort of peeled back some of the layers for all of us and is showing us what could be possible in a way that never would have been before. And we're seeing data and differences and just new approaches that were forced upon us, but have had sometimes, positive outcomes. And so I think it's very exciting to hear this. I know that I need to hand the microphone back to Tracy to do some Q&A, and we're very excited to open this up to our whole attendee list. I will admit to having dropped the ball ever so slightly. I was supposed to encourage people along the way to post questions and comments in the chat, but you all are way ahead of me and we're doing that anyway. But we are very excited to hopefully answer any additional comments, dig into some places where we haven't yet, and hear from people who are not on our panel. But before we do that, thank you very much to our panelists. This discussion was exceptional. I think I had no doubt that it would be, but thank you very much for having the honest conversations and for having this beginning, as Executive Director Williams said for us at the outset. So with that, I will hand it back to you, Tracy.
Thank you so much, Laura. And yes, just echoing your sentiments. Thank you to all of the panelists. I think this is a really, really important conversation, and we're talking about issues and policy options that have large impacts. So thank you so much. I also just want to acknowledge our Deputy Executive Director of the Department of Corrections, Ruth Kaufman, who has been answering questions within the chat. And so thank you so much for doing that. And I want to acknowledge Christy Donner, Glenn Tapia, and Andrew Matson for some of your comments and questions. So I want to open the floor. Feel free to either post your question in the chat function, or you can go ahead and take yourself off of mute. We have ample people to be able to answer all of your questions, whether that be from the presentations earlier today to the Department of Corrections leadership or to our panelists. And while people's gears are turning, no problem, take your time. Executive Director Kaufman, I wanted to give the floor to you for a moment. I know that you did start to answer some people's questions. I just wanted to check in to see if you had any additional comments or wanted to close the loop on some of the questions that we had seen earlier in the chat.
Yeah, well, so the one that I would love to go back in the slides if you can manage it. I know there's a lot. It's just, and I think that's, going back to Tipper's concerns about, Madam Vice Chair's Tipper's concerns or discussions with the DAs. I think the ultimate goal, right, is public safety, right? And so here's where I'm excited to see results of CJI's kind of continuing analysis and some projects that, oh, wait, go back, we're almost there. I think it's in there. It's like the reduction of technicals and some bouncing around with new crimes, right? Yeah, there we go. So you can see from this slide, right? You can actually see the impact of the murder of Tom Clements in this slide, right? So, he's trying to he came in and wanted to do a lot of changes of parole. And then with his assassination in 2013, you can see some increases in TPV that sort of took Division of Adult Parole a few years to kind of go back to. You can see they don't kind of catch up to their 2012 rate into 2016, which makes a lot of sense to me given the organizational trauma that the Department of Corrections suffered, and given politically where people in Colorado were after that murder. And so you can see, though, Glenn is seeing this kind of trend increase in new crimes, but what I'm seeing, though, is that it's sort of not a complete one for one, right? So it's not like for every technical that you decrease, you get one increase in new crimes. So there's some sort of cost benefit analysis that needs to happen there. I'd love to dive into more like what are the new crimes for, and like what is the public safety impact of those crimes. And then you see these decreases in 2020 and 2021, where all of a sudden, you know, you're just not seeing an increase. And so I think that'll be really interesting to follow up with data kind of later on. I think 2020 was an odd year for law enforcement in general, so I don't want to hang my hat on those new crime numbers that year. But even in 2021, you know, we're seeing these reductions. So I think those numbers are the right numbers to focus on. And I'm really hopeful that we can kind of continue our trend of reducing technicals while keeping, you know, returns with new crimes at bay.
Thank you, Director Kaufman. I see that we have 2 hands raised. Glenn, I will turn it over to you for your question.
Yeah, my question was really kind of directed at CGI. They had mentioned that probation were involved with CGI too, and they've done an outstanding job, you know, digging deep into our data, and we're about ready to see our data here pretty soon. And so my question is really for them from an analytical perspective. As I see the period from 2014 to 2019, you know, just kind of eyeballing it, I see about a 30% decrease in technical returns, but about a 50% increase in new crimes. And so although it looks negligible on the scale of the graph, that 30% decrease and 50% increase are meaningful to me. And so I wonder from an analytical perspective, are those related, or did we do any analysis of those related, or are those just coincidental, I guess I should say. So it was less of a policy, somewhat of a policy question, but more of an analytical one for the analysts with CGI, if they did any statistical analysis of the degree to which the downward trend of TVs and the upward trend of new crimes are empirically related.
Thank you so much. And Maya, I believe you're queued up to answer that one.
Yes, indeed.
Thank
That's
you.
exactly the reason I raised my hand to address that. So obviously, just looking at these numbers and looking at these trends, I can't necessarily speak to the decision making on the practice side as to whether the two are linked, whether they're related. I can say first that the technical violations, based on which violations they did tend to be decreasing across the board. We saw a little displacement in terms of absconding violations, how they're classified, but we didn't see a significant drop in any particular type of technical violation leading to that. It was more of an overall decrease. On the new crime side, what we saw driving that kind of slow increase up until 2019 is a rise in a violation that's in the CVDMP as all felonies, which, as you can imagine, you see that and you think, great, I have no follow-up questions as to what that means. So something that we're hoping to expand upon in our file review process, where we're going into a little more detail, is seeing what that violation encompasses, because all felonies is a very broad category. So we did want to do a slightly deeper dive into what exactly is driving that and what we're seeing as the most frequent new crime violations. So stay tuned. We'll hopefully have some more detail and some more answers on that front once that process is complete.
Thank you so much, Maya. Christy Donner, first of all, thank you so much for being so active and engaged throughout our event. I really appreciate it. I wanted to address your question, which I believe is directed to Ruth next, which is in the chat. So Christy wrote, Ruth, I'm also curious as to whether the increase in new crime is function of the DAs not relying so often for parole revocations to handle it, with parole revocations going down. Also, legislation was passed that mandated that parole refer parolees for escape for prosecution.
Yeah, and I think that is just such a good question. And we see so much regional variation in sentencing and also decisions made by DAs, that one of the things that I want to do with CJI is go back and kind of look at this stuff sort of regionally to see what happens, because I think one of the data points that they pointed us to is that, you know, during this period, the Denver and the metro area sort of decarcerated safely and the rural areas did not. right? So we have some areas that are actually now sending more people. Like if you look at the example of Alaska, right? It's just like, you know, in that state thing where they're just like, nope, we're bucking the trend. We're going to actually send more people back. I think we have some counties in the state that do that as well. And so I think that would be, as we, as a state, for people who are interested in criminal justice reform and interested in kind of doing this smartly, I think focusing also on what parts of the state really need some attention, I think would be helpful as well. So Christy, I don't have the I don't have either anecdotal or data evidence on that, but you're exactly right that that's a direction of analysis we need to do.
Thank you so much, Executive Director Kaufman. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you willingness to jump in and answer people's questions so responsibly. I see that Laura has raised her hand. So Laura, please.
Thanks, Tracy. Yeah, I just wanted to build off of what you were saying, Ruth, in that it sounds like this is a really important area. And as DOC, as you have, you know, identified through your partnership with CJI, and as you know, it is that piece that comes up, and it has so many dimensions, and it is regionally specific. And just as CJI presented, you know, race data and sex data and by risk level, and you know, you can imagine all of the different ways in which you could try and understand the dimensions of this issue. And I hope, and it sounds like from the questions that we have, a lot of folks are eager to, you know, sort of understand and try and unlock what all the different dimensions of that is in Colorado. And then I would invite you to, just as we're trying to do today, have that beginning of the conversation. What does it mean to better understand that, you know, the issue of new crimes versus revocation across the entire interlocking supervision system of Colorado, and in your 3 agencies, and you know, and think about where and how administrative policy and legislative policy could support your goals. And so I know you're very well situated with CJI in that endeavor. And so I just wanted to make sure to throw that out there and say, like, well, yes, you can do that. So thank you very much for being willing to interrogate that issue.
Thank you so much, Laura. I appreciate that. So first of all, this is not the end of the conversation. If you have further questions, comments, please reach out to myself or Valerie Mead from the CJI team. We are more than happy to continue the conversation and really just appreciate all of the attendance and participation. Once again, just a huge, huge thank you to our panelists for such a robust conversation. And before we close for the day, I did want to introduce Director Johnson. He's the Director of the Division of Adult Parole, to wrap us up for the day and give us our next steps.
Awesome. Well, first, we'd like to take the opportunity to thank all the panelists and attendees for joining the conversation today and for sharing constructive feedback about current parole practices and for engaging in the first of many conversations about what a policy framework supportive of supervision success can look like. We also want to acknowledge and thank both the Council of State Governments and the Crime and Justice Institute for assisting in our department with this endeavor. Laura and Valerie, we've been working, chopping at this for quite a bit, and your teams have been exceptional thought partners and your professional approach to this work is really appreciated. So thank you. And then finally, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the hard work of our staff within the Colorado Department of Corrections, the Division of Adult Parole, and our community-based partners. I think you all can appreciate as leaders, we develop strategies for improvement, but the real work is carried out by the diligent efforts of our staff, and for that, we are grateful to them. So this year, the Colorado Department of Corrections recorded its lowest recidivism rate. However, I think as practitioners and stakeholders, we know that number represents many lives, and frankly, it is just not low enough. Although we have had some success, our work needs to continue. So the Department of Corrections is excited to work in partnership with a diverse coalition to build on this recent success and see a sustained and have it sustained for years to come. We want to continue to see people exiting parole supervision due to successful completion of sentences. We also want to continue to see people exiting parole through earned and incentivized release because they have accomplished the goals they've set for themselves and because they have accomplished the goals and the conditions of their supervision. We want to continue to build and reinforce community-based support systems that are so crucial to this initial and continued success on parole. We are encouraged and excited to see that there's a diverse group of people and stakeholders that want to work with this and build on and sustain our success on parole. So thank you very much. The work is just beginning. The ideas and thoughts we expressed today need to further be explored through data analysis, obviously, some continued conversation, and development of policy and recommendations for DOC administrative policies and legislative action. So DOC is interested in working with our partners in our legislation and crafting quality legislation that reflects our incentive-focused approach to supporting supervision success and that gives us the ability to implement innovative and effective administrative policies to help our clients to achieve that success. So once again, thank you. Thank you everybody for participating today and your attendance, your engaged attendance.
Thank you so much, everyone. Just a reminder that please reach out if you have any questions and concerns, and we will be posting an edited version of this, and we'll follow up with you about next steps. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.